May 12, 1846 was the day John Charles Fremont's exploring party killed 17 Klamath people beside Upper Klamath Lake, 2 days after several of his own men had died there. And that attack stood near the beginning of the long series of border lake conflicts that would, 2 decades later, lead toward the lava stronghold later called Infernal Caverns. Contemporary summaries of that incident described Fremont's men approaching a Klamath village on the shore of Upper Klamath Lake at night, and opening fire into the houses and into people who tried to flee. When the shooting ended, 17 Klamath people lay dead and the expedition left the ruins of the settlement behind. The message carried by that episode was simple and brutal on both sides. Armed parties crossing the lakes and lava fields now expected killing, not cautious trade or brief visits when trouble appeared. The country that absorbed that first shock stretched far beyond the edge of Upper Klamath Lake. To the southwest, the spine of the Cascades dropped toward Mount Shasta and the deep cuts of the Upper Sacramento. To the southeast, beyond Lost River and Tool Lake, lava plateaus and low volcanic ridges ran toward Goose Lake, the Pitt River, and the Warner Mountains. High basalt benches broke into separate valleys with pine on the higher slopes and sage and bunchgrass on the flats. Winter snow locked the high ground, spring melt-filled creeks and wetlands, and by late summer the grass turned dry under a hard sky. For the native communities who lived there, that variety in elevation and water made possible a finely tuned cycle of hunting, fishing, and gathering. Among those communities were the people now known as the Pitt River Tribe, including the Huasidawi, whose home lay around Goose Lake and south along the Pitt River and the plateau called Devil's Garden. Their territory ran from Fandango Valley south through the Warner Mountains to Cedar Pass, then west over the river and out onto the high plateau and north along the western shore of Goose Lake. Villages lay near springs, creek mouths, and sheltered benches. Families moved between them in a steady pattern across the year. Deer, elk, and smaller game were taken in the hills. Fish, waterfowl, and trapped animals came from the lakes and wetlands. Roots and seeds filled woven burden baskets, and winter houses were stocked with dried meat and stored fish. The people there knew each draw, ridge, and rock ledge and understood how water and game moved across the basin. That understanding included the narrow places where trails and game paths pinched down between lake and rock wall. Long before wagons crossed the plateau, those choke points mattered for hunting and for defense. A party moving with pack animals along the north shore of Tool Lake had little room between the steep spur of the mountain and the soft ground at the water's edge. Rocks and shallow caves above the track gave any watcher solid cover to see who approached, how many there were, and how they were armed. When the first white trappers and traders passed through, they learned that any carelessness near those places could cost them stock or lives. Journals from the fur trade era describe stolen traps and animals and sudden arrows from the tools or the brush along the water's edge. The men who wrote those entries often framed such attacks as unprovoked theft. For the people whose land they crossed, the same incidents were defensive blows against a new threat that took animals, cut wood, and frightened game. By the time the first organized emigrant parties came through the lake and lava country in the 1840s, that pattern of tension was well established. The Applegate brothers opened a southern route to Oregon in 1846 that crossed the Warner Mountains and passed between the lakes and lava fields along what is now the Oregon and California line. In their instructions to emigrants, they warned that this stretch required special vigilance because of Indian attacks. Trail guides told overland families to guard their stock, post sentries at night, and be ready for sudden assaults in the bad places along the lakes. The warnings were based on hard experience. In 1846, along that same general route, an emigrant named John Newton was killed by Indians while traveling with a party that tried the new road. Others reported arrows shot into their stock and thefts that turned back trains short of their destination. 2 years later, in 1848, Peter Lassen pushed a small wagon train south from Goose Lake, down along the Pitt River, and into the Sacramento Valley, opening the line that came to be known as the Lassen Trail. News of gold in California drove a much heavier stream of traffic along that path the next year. By 1849, about half of the gold rush emigration to California crossed the Pitt River on that route. Camps, grazing grounds, and woodlots that had long been used by Pitt River and neighboring people suddenly filled with large companies of emigrants and their animals. Emigrant diaries from those seasons describe broken axles, dead cattle, and long stretches with little graze or water, and they also complain of what the writers called depredations by Indians. In the same valleys, tribal histories describe cattle and horses turned into prime food gathering areas and heavy use of timber in places that had supported native communities for generations. As more wagons came, the stories of isolated thefts and small raids gave way to descriptions of pitched fights and planned ambushes. Along the north bank of Tule Lake, near a rocky point that jutted out into the water, the emigrant road narrowed between a spur of the mountain and a flat covered with tules and wild rye. That place became known as Bloody Point. In late summer of 1852, Modoc fighters used the rocks and brush above the track to ambush a small party of packers traveling ahead of the main trains. Only one man, named Coffin in later accounts, cut free a pack animal and forced his way through the attackers to reach safety. When he arrived in Eureka with news that his companions had been killed at that constricted bend, fear and anger swept the mining town. Volunteers formed a relief and retaliation party almost at once, and while they organized, more emigrant wagons pressed westward, unaware of what had happened ahead of them. The rescue column rode east along the trail, but the work of killing at Bloody Point and along the connected lakes had already spread beyond the first ambush. Accounts collected from rescuers describe a wagon train that crossed from Clear Lake toward Tule Lake and saw warriors massed among the rocks overlooking the road while 3 white guides rode ahead, not yet aware of the danger. Farther along the trail, searchers found wagons burned or stripped, livestock dead or missing, and bodies scattered on the ground. Contemporary reports compiled after the events described 12 additional white deaths at the hands of border lake tribes that season, separate from those killed in the main Bloody Point attack. For miners and settlers in Eureka and other new communities, the details confirmed every rumor about the dangers of lands around Tule Lake and the lava fields to the south. Violence in that direction did not flow only from the native side. In 1851, a party of about 20 whites under Captain Samuel Smith, guided by the well-known Indian fighter Ben Wright, set out from Eureka to recover about 200 stolen animals they blamed on the Modocs. On the way, they camped among one Modoc village, then took advantage of that trust to strike the people who had welcomed them. Contemporary descriptions state that they killed 16 people in that village, then went on into the Lost River country and killed another 15 or 20 Modocs in a second attack. The white party suffered only a few minor wounds and returned with 34 head of stock. In surviving native oral histories and later recollections, such killings were remembered alongside wagon train attacks, and were cited as reasons to meet later incursions with force rather than conversation. Scattered entries from that same regional chronology list other killings and clashes along the trails. 6 whites were reported killed near Bloody Point in 1851, even before the larger massacre. Survey officers mapping possible railroad routes through the Warner Mountains reported serious danger in the high country. Around that time, Captain William H. Warner of the Topographical Engineers and 2 of his men were killed on the eastern side of the Warners by Indians identified in later writings as probably Paiutes. Emigrant accounts from 1849 and the early 1850s mention numerous fights and deaths along the Pitt River where lines of wagons tried to push through while short of food and ammunition. Through the 1850s, the Lake and Pitt River country changed from an area crossed seasonally by trappers and small parties into a funnel that carried a steady flow of migrants, miners, and stock. The discovery of gold at Eureka and in the Rogue River country brought large numbers of aggressive young men, and contemporary army officers noted that many of them were the most undisciplined and violent elements from mining camps all over the Pacific slope. Reports written by those officers argued that but for such men, many of the tribes of southern Oregon and far northern California would have remained relatively peaceful if treated with consistent fairness. Instead, vigilantism and retaliation hardened attitudes on both sides. Each new killing, whether of a herder, a trapper, a Modoc family, or a Pitt River hunter, deepened the sense that compromise was impossible. The Pitt River people watched this transformation on their own ground. The Huasidawi villages around Goose Lake had long occupied what they described as 100 miles square, bounded roughly by Mount Shasta and Lassen Peak to the west, and the Warner Range to the east. As emigrant traffic thickened in the 1840s and 1850s and then gave way to permanent settlement, the natural environment changed with startling speed. Emigrant accounts mention cutting timber for fuel and bridge building. Tribal histories describe cattle and horses grazing the best meadows and the later arrival of large flocks of sheep that disrupted traditional food supplies. Some families chose to avoid the newcomers, moving higher into the hills and more remote corners of the plateau. Others struck at wagon trains and herds that entered their best hunting and gathering areas. In this period, several Huasidawi bands joined neighboring Astarawi, Cosealecte, Hamawi, Modoc, and Paiute groups in sporadic uprisings against settlers and passing trains. Federal and state authorities responded unevenly. At times, militia officers and Indian agents tried to calm tensions, escorting trains through the worst trouble spots and negotiating temporary settlements. At other moments, local volunteers formed posses that carried out punitive expeditions whose main result was the killing of native families and the destruction of their food stores. The pattern held across a wide swath of the interior Northwest. Along the main Oregon Trail, a historian later estimated that between 1840 and 1860, just over 360 emigrants were killed by Indians, while more than 425 Indians were killed by emigrants. Most of that bloodshed took place in the country west of the Rocky Mountains. The same streams of migrants and the same grim logic of revenge shaped events in the Pitt River Basin, the Warner Mountains, and the lakes straddling the line between Oregon and California. When the Civil War began in 1861, regular Army units were pulled toward the major theaters of fighting east of the Mississippi. In Northern California, Southern Oregon, and the deserts of what are now Nevada and Idaho, that withdrawal left a military vacuum. Local volunteer regiments, scattered regular detachments, and self-organized militias tried to handle everything from stage line protection and mail escort duty to open warfare with well-armed native bands. Tribal groups that had already seen years of encroachment and killings now faced a mix of undersupplied professionals and undisciplined volunteers. In this setting, raids on remote ranches and wagon trains became more common. Settlers in small communities like Honey Lake Valley, Surprise Valley, and the emerging ranching country near Goose Lake wrote of stock driven off, isolated families killed, and travelers disappearing in the high desert. By 1863, the region that stretched from the Owyhee and Snake Rivers across to the Pitt River, Goose Lake, and the Warner Mountains had become one continuous theater of small wars. Newspapers and official reports grouped the disparate Paiute, Bannock, Shoshone, and related bands under the loose label of Snake Indians and treated nearly every armed native group in that broad area as part of the same enemy. For the people on the native side, the picture looked different. Huasidawi families remembered the loss of meadows and springs. Modocs carried memories of Bloody Point and the killings carried out by Ben Wright's party. Paiute groups remembered abandoned winter camps and relatives who had died in skirmishes and reprisal raids. On the white side, miners and ranchers held up names like Bloody Point, Rogue River, and Snake River as warning stories about what happened when travelers let their guard down. Into that unstable landscape stepped officers who had cut their teeth in the Civil War and were now reassigned to the Pacific Northwest. One of them was George Crook, a career soldier who had already served in California before the war, and who had been badly wounded by an arrow during a campaign in Pitt River country several years earlier. His familiarity with that interior terrain and his record as a relentless field commander led senior officers to see him as a natural choice to deal with the growing violence in the basins and plateaus of the far west. When he received orders after the Civil War to take command in the region around Fort Boise and the Owyhee, he entered a country where every lava ridge, narrow canyon, and line of willows along a creek could be the site of an ambush. The long string of attacks, reprisals, and uneasy truces that began in the 1840s had not produced any lasting settlement by the end of 1863. Instead, they had left both settler communities and native bands armed, wary, and deeply accustomed to sudden violence. The lake country, the Pitt River Basin, the Goose Lake Plateau, and the Warner Mountains were no longer just remote valleys on maps. They had become known among soldiers, emigrants, and tribal leaders as hard ground, where neither side expected mercy. That history formed the ground on which later campaigns would move south from Goose Lake and into the lava walls, fumaroles, and caverns near what would be called likely California, where Crook and the bands he pursued would finally meet in the fight remembered as the Battle of Infernal Caverns, 1852 to 1864. The killings at the lakes and along the Pitt River did not fade into stories told only in winter cabins. They stayed close to the surface in every settlement that faced east toward the high desert. In Eureka, Jacksonville, Shasta, and the small ranching pockets in the valleys between, men who had ridden to look for lost trains or missing herds kept the worst sights fixed in their minds. Women who had helped bury travelers or nurse survivors out of shock and fever remembered the faces. Young boys grew up listening to accounts of ambushes beside Tool Lake, massacres in the draws above the Pitt River, and sudden raids in the meadows that seemed safe until shots or arrows came in from the sage. Those memories shaped how the next phase of the conflict would look long before the first volunteer muster rolls were written. The wagons and pack trains that still chose the Lassen and Applegate routes in the early 1850s moved through country already scarred by that first decade of encounters. Word of the Bloody Point ambush and the retaliatory killings to the south traveled fast. Travelers heard that Modoc and Pitt River bands had shown they could watch a trail for days, choose a place where the road squeezed tight between rock and water, and strike with discipline rather than with scattered shots. At the same time, the tribes watched how quickly mining towns could raise mounted companies and ride out in strength when white travelers were killed. Each side drew practical lessons. For native families, it seemed clear that if they struck emigrant trains or herds near settled country, they should expect swift pursuit by men with repeating rifles or heavy percussion muskets. For settlers, it became accepted wisdom that any show of weakness in remote areas, any sign of panic, would be answered with more raids. In the summers after the Bloody Point killings, emigrant diaries and letters described a caution that hardened into routine. Parties spaced their wagons close enough for mutual defense when passing the worst stretches of Tool Lake and the Pitt River bluffs. Men mounted guard through entire nights rather than only until the moon sank. Travelers walked beside their teams with loaded arms in hand and extra ammunition in saddle holsters rather than stowed deep in the wagons. On the native side of the same country, scouts watched these changes from the rock rims above the lakes and from low rises where dust plumes showed how many animals passed each season. Smaller bands chose to harass outlying stock and lone riders instead of trying to overwhelm larger wagon trains. The style of fighting shifted away from single large massacres and toward more frequent smaller attacks. Out beyond the reach of established towns, the reactions took a different form. Ranchers in Honey Lake Valley, Surprise Valley, and the new settlements edging into the Goose Lake Basin could not count on quick help from mining centers. They organized their own patrols and built small log stockades around barns and houses. Men slept with loaded rifles stacked near the doors and pistols hung on pegs by the beds. Young boys and girls learned to bring animals in close to corrals at dusk and to move them out again only after riders had scanned the tree lines and the edges of the sage flats. The rifle pits that men dug into low knolls around some of these ranches showed how seriously they took the threat of sudden attack. For native groups moving through those same valleys, the sight of ringed homesteads and guarded stock reinforced the belief that the new arrivals had come to stay and would not relax their hold without force. The state and federal response in the early 1850s came in fits and starts. In some years, Indian agents negotiated local agreements that reduced fighting for a season. In other years, militia officers raised companies at the first rumor of a killing and rode east into the lava beds and sagebrush country with orders to punish any bands caught near a crime, regardless of direct involvement. Those expeditions moved light, with pack animals carrying flour, bacon, ammunition, and blankets, and with each man expected to keep himself and his horse in the field for weeks. When such companies found villages, they often struck at dawn, when most of the men were away hunting or watching trails. Women, children, and elders died in those surprises, along with any warriors caught inside the camps. Each time, survivors carried the news deeper into the interior. During the same period, the United States Army began to place more permanent posts near the troubled lines of travel. Small detachments built log stockades and adobe barracks along river crossings and in defensible valleys, their locations chosen to anchor stage lines and emigrant roads. From these posts, junior officers led patrols along the main routes, visited fledgling settlements, and tried to keep up with the shifting positions of independent native bands. The soldiers carried standard infantry muskets and carbines, dragoon sabers for mounted men, and a limited number of revolvers. Their uniforms, heavy wool tunics and trousers made sense on damp coastal stations, but weighed on them in the dry heat of the interior. Native fighters, by contrast, moved in clothing suited to the country. Leggings and shirts of tanned hide or cloth acquired through trade, and often carried multiple weapons at once, a bow or lance and a captured rifle, along with knives and war clubs. In the ledges and gullies that cut the basalt plains south of Warner Mountain and around the northern reaches of the Pitt River, the two forces learned more about each other than either side admitted in public reports. Army patrols that rode into these breaks discovered that small parties of warriors could use the shape of the rock to disappear within short distances. A column might ride along a dry wash with steep walls and see no one then when it tried to leave the channel at a narrow point, take several shots from hidden positions above and never see who fired. Native fighters saw that blue-coated troopers, once committed to a narrow path, moved awkwardly when they tried to dismount and scramble up the slopes. Horses balked at the loose stone. Men loaded and fired while crouched behind scant cover, their field of vision limited by the same rock walls that had looked harmless from a distance. Some of the most telling clashes in these years took place not in well-known locations but in anonymous canyons and ridges that never made it onto official maps. A patrol might push into unknown ground after a report of stolen stock, follow a fresh track line into a basin closed on three sides, and find that the only exit lay through a cut between hooded outcroppings that offered perfect cover to waiting riflemen. If the officers sensed the danger in time, they sent scouts up the slopes first and moved through in extended order, presenting few close targets at any one point. If they did not, the column rode straight into a short storm of bullets and arrows. Reports of such fights speak of horses collapsing at the front of the column, of men trying to drag wounded comrades out by their belts, and of how difficult it was to see the attackers among the broken stone. For the native side, these years were a period of learning in another sense. News of fights in southern Oregon, northeastern California, and across into the basins of what is now Nevada traveled between related bands. Northern Paiute, Bannock, Shoshone, Modoc, and Pitt River people traded information on how quickly soldiers could move, how long it took them to respond to an attack, and which routes they preferred for pursuit. They saw that the army had fewer men than the long distances required and that commanders often relied on small, scattered posts rather than large central forts. They watched how livestock contracts and mail routes dictated where troops spent most of their time. From that observation came a rough understanding that if they drew soldiers away from settled valleys and well-traveled routes and into the hardest terrain, they could inflict more damage than any direct attack on a fort. Settlers and local officials grasped that logic from their side of the fights. County records and personal letters from the early 1860s complained that the regular army could not protect every road and ranch. Civilians asked for more permanent posts and more troops, and when they did not receive them, they turned again to volunteer companies. These units, raised under state or territorial authority, often adapted quickly to the conditions on the ground. Men rode light, carried extra ammunition, and learned from scouts which waterholes sustained movement across long, dry stretches. Some units adopted looser formations than standard Army drill manuals allowed, spreading across ridges in skirmish lines rather than marching in tight columns into unknown country. Armed mostly with percussion rifles and revolvers, they tried to close with smaller bands before they slipped away. In the western parts of the interior, such as the valleys feeding into the Pitt River Basin, the balance between military garrisons and volunteer companies shifted repeatedly. In some years, regular troops provided the backbone of frontier defense. In others, especially when national demands pulled regiments elsewhere, volunteers carried the burden. Tribes saw the difference. Regulars under orders from distant headquarters sometimes followed strict instructions about when they could attack and when they had to escort prisoners to posts for confinement. Volunteers, particularly when composed of men from nearby mining towns, often took a harsher view. Their actions in the field sometimes blurred the line between military operation and personal revenge. Recognizing this, some native leaders began to treat regular posts and regular officers as more predictable adversaries and volunteers as more volatile threats. As the 1860s opened, large parts of the Great Basin and interior Northwest remained outside direct settler control, but traffic through the region increased. Stage lines linked California and Oregon with the wider national network, and wagon roads fed newer mining camps in the interior. Contracts to carry mail and passengers depended on predictable schedules. Delays caused by raids or fear of ambush threatened those schedules and, by extension, the flow of information and wealth. That pressure produced a new wave of efforts to secure travel corridors. Army officers planned patrol routes with an eye on coaching stations and water stops. Where possible, they built small posts near key segments of stage roads. Local authorities pressed for telegraph connections that would shorten the time between an attack and the arrival of help. The Snake War, as people later called the broad series of campaigns that began in the mid-1860s, did not start with a single declaration or a single fight. It grew from this accumulation of pressures and from specific incidents scattered across a wide region. When ranches in southern Idaho lost herds to raids in a single season, when stage drivers disappeared along remote stretches, When survey crews reported taking fire from unseen marksmen on the heights above their camp, the complaints converged. Reports from Nevada, Idaho, Oregon, and Northern California crossed the desks of the same departmental commanders. The scattered names of bands involved, Paiute here, Bannock there, Shoshone elsewhere, blurred into the single label of snake. In the minds of many officers and settlers, this simplified picture justified treating every armed native band in that swath of country as part of one problem. In the borderland between Oregon and California, the same logic translated into concrete decisions. Commanders reinforced some posts and abandoned others. They chose to hold positions that protected the most heavily traveled stage and freight routes, even if that meant leaving some distant valleys to handle their own defense. Crops and stock in those less protected areas became easy targets for native groups who wished to punish settlers or reclaim resources. Each burned ranch house, each stolen herd, and each killed herder or freighter increased the volume of appeals for stronger action. The cycle of raids and reprisals tightened further, and with it, the willingness of officers to follow native bands deep into the most difficult terrain increased. Within this atmosphere, younger native warriors who had grown up hearing about the early fights along the lakes and the killings carried out by volunteer parties began to play larger roles in planning and carrying out resistance. They had learned from their elders which canyons and ridges had offered the best ground in earlier conflicts. They had watched soldiers move through their country and had seen where the army's animals tired and where men suffered most from heat, cold, or thirst. They knew that the American habit of pursuit, the desire to chase any broken band until it seemed destroyed, could be used as a weapon. If they could cut a few men from a column, leave a bloody trail that seemed to lead toward escape, then draw the pursuers into a place where rock, brush, and narrow passages limited movement, they could inflict more casualties than a direct fight in open ground. The learning on the Army side continued as well. Officers who rotated through the interior posts kept notes on how quickly native bands could move, how far they could travel between water sources, and what signs indicated an approaching ambush. Some advocated mounted scouting with smaller, more agile detachments rather than lumbering patrols. Others pushed for the recruitment of native scouts familiar with the country and with the tactics of the bands being pursued. Those scouts, drawn from tribes or bands with rivalry or long-standing conflicts with the groups at war with the government, brought intimate knowledge of hiding places and escape routes. Their presence on Army patrols reduced the number of times columns rode blind into choke points, but it did not eliminate the danger because the landscape itself remained complex, and the people defending it remained highly motivated. By the middle of the 1860s, the patterns established in the years since the first emigrant trails crossed the Pitt River and the lakes had solidified. On one side stood scattered posts, volunteer companies, and regular units trying to protect a growing network of routes, settlements, and economic interests. On the other stood bands of northern Paiute, Pitt River, Modoc, and related peoples who had seen their best lands taken, their families killed, and their freedom narrowed by the spread of those same routes and settlements. Each side had learned from the other. Soldiers knew that rocky draws and tight canyons were dangerous. Native fighters knew that soldiers often pushed too far in pursuit when they believed they could crush a band and end a threat. It was in that shared but hostile understanding that the idea of using the land not only as cover but as a built killing ground matured. In the basalt benches and broken lava just south of Goose Lake and along the branches of the Pitt River, some of the men who would later shape events at the place called Infernal Caverns already understood that the surest way to hurt an enemy who believed he had won was to invite him deeper into ground chosen precisely to trap him. In the spring of 1864, the first regular stages painted in bright colors rolled out of towns on the Columbia and in the Sacramento Valley with schedules that promised fixed departure days and fixed arrival days, even though the road ahead crossed country where no promise lasted long. Coach bodies rocked on thoroughbraces over ruts and stones while teams of 4 or 6 horses leaned into the traces. Inside, passengers sat with knees pressed together, rifles or shotguns wedged upright between boots, listening to the driver's whip crack and watching the low lines of the horizon for any movement that did not belong to dust or wind. Every mile carried them through land where northern Paiute, Pitt River, Shoshone and Modoc people still moved along routes they had used long before any stage company printed a timetable. Freight outfits moved slower but carried the weight that mining camps needed to survive. Long strings of heavy wagons left Chico, Red Bluff, and Marysville loaded with flour, salted meat, picks, shovels, powder, fuse, and spare machinery. Oxen or mules strained in double and triple yokes, hooves sinking into soft stretches near rivers, and pounding the earth into powder on dry flats. Drivers walked beside or ahead of the teams with rawhide whips in hand, hats pulled low, shirts stuck to their backs with sweat or stiff with frost depending on season. By 1864, dozens of such strings crawled at any time toward Boise Basin, the Owyhee diggings or isolated mining districts scattered between the Columbia and the California line. Station keepers built low structures of logs or adobe at intervals along the routes, close enough that a stage could change horses within a reasonable span of hours. Each station kept a small corral, a clutch of spare teams, a store of baled hay or stacked native grass, and a cache of grain if it could be hauled. The more exposed posts had crude loopholes cut into their walls, extra rifle ports facing the approaches, and earthen banks thrown against the outside to catch bullets. Station families lived there under constant tension. Women cooked for riders and passengers while keeping pistols close at hand. Children grew up knowing exactly where to go and what to do when someone shouted that mounted figures were coming fast from the sage. For native communities, those narrow rectangles of cleared ground and corrals marked more than waypoints for white travelers. Each station, each freight camp, each waterhole where stock trampled the banks showed that the net of occupation had spread wider. Herds heading to Boise Basin or the Owyhee camps grazed on the same sparse grasses that sustained native horses and wild game. Springs that had once seen small family groups filling baskets and water skins now saw continuous traffic. At night, fires from freight camps showed on hillsides where elders remembered gathering seeds or digging roots in quiet. Raiding parties adapted to this new pattern. Instead of concentrating solely on large emigrant trains as they had in earlier years, warriors began to study the new traffic. They counted how many wagons moved with a particular outfit, how many armed men rode beside them, and how far apart the strings spaced their camps. They observed that the richest prize was often not the goods on the wagons, but the horses and mules that pulled them. A single well-timed rush at dawn or in the black hour before it could drive off animals worth months of labor in a mining camp. If the warriors left the wagons standing, they could move faster with their captured stock and draw pursuit away from more vulnerable parts of their home ranges. Freight captains understood the danger and reacted as best they could. Many outfits began coupling several strings together for the most exposed legs of the routes. Where once 10 wagons might have moved with only 2 armed guards beyond the drivers themselves, now 20 or 30 wagons pushed out in a single combined column with extra riders circling at a distance. Camps were set up in deliberate patterns. Wagons were drawn into defensive circles or squares, tongues inward with stock picketed inside or within close reach. Guards stayed up in pairs or small groups through the night rather than relying on a single sentry. Coffee boiled in kettles beside low fires, and men listened to the creak of harness and the occasional stamp of a tethered animal, while they stared into darkness broken only by starlight and the shapes of low hills. Stage companies added armed men to the top seats beside drivers. Some hired ex-soldiers who knew how to handle carbines from a moving coach body and who understood how hard it could be to change horses under fire. Revolvers and shotguns were kept close at hand on the box. Passengers paid more when lines advertised extra protection. Yet no rifle across a driver's knees could change the basic fact that stages moved on fixed schedules and along fixed routes. Native warriors knew exactly where the road crossed a narrow creek bottom, where it twisted between rocky shoulders and where it climbed a grade so steep that teams slowed to a walk. Those places became points of constant tension. Reports reached town papers and military posts of coaches brought to abrupt halts in those constricted stretches. A tree pushed across the road, a loose boulder rolled down from above, or a sudden volley of shots from the rim was enough to turn an ordinary daylight run into a fight for survival. Drivers threw reins, guards fired from exposed seats, and passengers scrambled to use the coach body for cover, some trying to return fire through windows smeared with dust and gun smoke. At times, a determined defense drove raiders off with nothing to show but a few dead horses and empty cartridge cases left in the sage. At other times, the attackers shot down animals, snatched what they could from the wreckage, and faded before help arrived from the next station. The army tried to overlay a pattern of patrols on this moving network. Commands posted small detachments at vulnerable crossings, at ferries, and near passes where freight routes crested ridges. Infantry companies marched along the roads in slow, grinding circuits, boots wearing ruts into the dust or mud a few miles each day. Cavalry detachments rode broader arcs, scouting away from the main tracks in search of fresh sign. Officers kept crude logs of distances between stations and water sources, carefully noting where most attacks had occurred. Yet the scale of the country defeated any attempt at continuous coverage. When a detachment marched on one road, raiders struck on another. When a regiment concentrated near one cluster of mining camps, riders from distant bands tested the edges of settlement hundreds of miles away. In many districts, the actual day-to-day burden of defense fell to the people who used the roads most. Stage line owners rode with their coaches when rumors of new raids spread. Freight captains built informal agreements to travel together and to share watch duties. Ranchers whose pastures lay near the routes formed neighborhood patrols that rode out along ridges at dawn to check for fresh sign. Men from one valley carried mail and warnings to the next, telling which springs had seen enemy tracks, which stations had been harassed, and where bodies had been found beside burned wagons. The pressure of constant alarm wore on families in small settlements that dotted the approach to the Pitt River Basin and the Goose Lake Plateau. In Honey Lake Valley, in Surprise Valley, in the string of ranching pockets edging eastward from the Sacramento watershed, household routines shifted around the possibility of attack. Women moved water, cooked meals, and tended gardens with rifles stacked near doors. Older children rode ahead of wagon teams to scan creek crossings before stock was driven through. Younger children learned to recognize the sound of distant shots and the meaning of a sudden order to get down and stay still. On the native side of the same hills and valleys, families felt the weight of war in different ways. Camps moved more often, avoiding spots that patrols had discovered. Groups that once joined larger gatherings for ceremonies in particular clearings or along certain streams hesitated to return to those sites when they knew scouts from opposing bands had spotted soldiers there. Some families chose to live nearer to high basalt benches, where rock offered better shelter and where smoke from their fires blended more easily with background haze. Hunters and raiding parties spent more of their time watching the roads, counting wagons and horse herds, trying to understand where the greatest threat and the greatest opportunity now lay. Some of the hardest blows in this period fell on people who never carried a gun. Chinese miners who worked tailings or marginal claims or who took contracts on construction and roadwork traveled in groups that did not always enjoy the same level of armed protection as outfits tied directly to powerful white interests. When such parties moved from one district to another, they often did so with few rifles and limited knowledge of the country. At least one group of Chinese laborers moving toward inland diggings in these years never reached its destination. Accounts that filtered back described a party caught in broken country, attacked with sudden force and stripped of everything. Different tellings gave different numbers for the dead, but all agreed that the site had been a scene of horrific butchery, and that no one from the targeted group survived to tell a full story in his own words. News of that killing intensified fear among all travelers whose routes crossed similar ground. The same rugged country that gave raiders cover also placed them at risk when they misjudged the strength or resolve of the people they targeted. Volunteer companies raised from mining towns such as Silver City, Ruby City, and others in the Oahe district rode out determined to make examples of any band they caught near a raid site. One such company followed reports of tracks into canyons along Boulder Creek. The volunteers expected to surprise a small encampment. Instead, they found fighting positions laid out along the rims and within folds of rock that overlooked likely approaches. When the first shots dropped horses and men in the narrow spaces between boulders, the volunteers discovered that exiting that ground under fire was more dangerous than entering it. For several days, they huddled behind makeshift breastworks of stone and brush, short of water and food, before regular troops fought their way in to relieve them. Incidents like that one drove home a lesson already familiar to many older officers, that confidence could turn quickly into near disaster when in pursuit of an enemy who understood the landscape better. A few veteran commanders began insisting that no detachment should push deep into unknown ravines or across plateau edges without scouts from tribes hostile to the bands being chased. Even with such help, commanders warned junior officers against riding headlong along any route that narrowed sharply between rock walls. Farther south and west, toward the Pitt River country and the approaches to Goose Lake, conditions mirrored those in the Oahe and Boise districts, even if the specific names and distances differed. Freight wagons from the Sacramento Valley passed through meadows where Pitt River families had camped for generations. Stage roads cut across low divides that separated one drainage from another, so that a single raiding party could strike in more than one valley if it moved quickly. Reports from ranches along these approaches spoke of stock driven off in small bunches, of herders shot from behind low rises, and of bodies found near waterholes. Settlers complained that garrisons were too far away and that patrols appeared only after the damage had been done. Some officers in that region tried to bridge the gap by establishing temporary camps closer to danger points. They pitched tents or threw up crude shelters near known trouble spots, sometimes staying just long enough to convince hostile bands to move their activities elsewhere. When those camps broke up, raiders tested the same ground again. The action resembled a slow, grinding contest over space rather than a single, clear campaign. In that contest, every death, every stolen horse, every burned wagon increased pressure up the chain of command. By early 1867, department headquarters had accumulated stacks of reports that all told versions of the same story. Roads essential to mining and settlement passed through terrain controlled in practice by native bands who had not accepted the new order. Local volunteers had fought hard but had taken severe losses when they blundered into prepared positions. Small regular detachments had done what they could but lacked numbers to hold every route and to chase every raiding party. Civilian companies threatened to close routes or raise their prices if protection did not improve. Settlers in exposed valleys wrote of leaving their homes if they did not see stronger measures. All of that pressure moved upward into discussions that centered on who would take broader control of operations and on where new campaigns would be directed. Officers already in the field argued that efforts must reach beyond the Owyhee and Boise basins, across the spine of the interior, and down toward the chain of lakes, lava shelves, and broken ridges around Goose Lake and the Upper Pitt River. That region, they warned, had long provided paths and shelters for bands moving between Oregon and Northern California. And if raiders were pushed out of the northern routes, they would fall back on those older refuges. Within that rough country lay deep cracks in the earth, lava caves and natural walls of rock where any force that pursued too far without careful reconnaissance could suddenly find itself stopped, exposed, and taking fire from an enemy it could not see clearly. The stage roads and freight tracks that tied the districts together had created the need for a more decisive push, and the ground toward which that push would eventually move already waited, silent with its own advantages shaped in stone. December 1866 was the month George Crook stepped off the stage at Fort Boise and walked into a district where every road out into the basins carried more complaints than the last officer had been able to answer. The post itself sat in cold light, low buildings of timber and adobe around a parade ground that had gone hard under winter frost. Smoke from the chimneys hung in a thin layer over the roofs before the wind cut it away toward the river. Men in worn wool coats moved between barracks, stables, and storehouses with the stiff, economical gait of soldiers who had already spent years on frontier duty. They watched the new commander with the quick, measuring look of men who wanted to know if he meant to stay inside by the stove or ride out with them into the country that had cost so many horses and lives. Crook did not look like the kind of officer who enjoyed parade fronts or speeches. He was lean from field campaigning, with a beard that he kept trimmed close, and eyes that seemed to study every line of the horizon. He had seen this side of the continent before the Civil War, when he had ridden in Northern California and Oregon, and once taken an arrow that had driven through flesh and left fragments he carried ever after. That wound had taught him that the men who fought from the rocks and sage knew their land better than any officer who read about it from a desk. The papers on his table at Fort Boise, bundles of letters from miners, stage operators, and previous commanders, only confirmed what he already believed, that the scattered posts and irregular patrols of earlier years had not broken native resistance. Within days of arriving, he brought his company and post commanders into a cold room where maps were spread on a rough table. The thick paper showed the Snake River curving through deep cuts, the Owyhee country broken by canyons, and the wagon routes drawn as thin lines across an enormous space. Around those lines, someone had penciled notes beside place names that meant more to the men in the room than they did to anyone at department headquarters. By some crossings, there were short comments: 1 freighter killed, 6 mules taken. Others had harder entries: miners wiped out, no survivors, or coaches looted and burned. Crook listened while officers and civilian packers explained which notes hid more than they revealed, which crossings were death traps in certain seasons, which stations had already been rebuilt once after attacks. The winter air outside cut into lungs as if it had weight. Crook decided that same cold would squeeze native camps just as tightly. Earlier officers had pulled their units into posts once the snow settled, conserving animals and supplies until spring. Crook refused to accept that rhythm. He ordered preparations for a campaign that would start in deep winter and drive into the country where bands made their cold season camps. His instructions were blunt. Men would carry only what they needed most. Ammunition, blankets, and rations took precedence over comfort. Wagons would be kept to a minimum. Pack animals would carry flour, bacon, coffee, and spare cartridges. The column would live as close to the line of hunger and exhaustion as he believed they could stand without breaking. The day the column left Fort Boise, the sky was clear and hard, and the ground under the horses' hooves rang with frost. Infantrymen wrapped their scarves higher around their faces, leaving only eyes exposed. Cavalry troopers pulled caps down low and tried not to think about the miles ahead. A few scouts from Allied bands rode near the front, men who knew the breaks in the ridges and the locations of waterholes that did not freeze solid. They wore a mixture of government-issue clothing and garments from their own people, wool coats over shirts of tanned hide, and carried both rifles and knives. Their job was to read the land in a way the white officers could not, to notice cut branches, turned stones, and faint tracks in snow that told where families had passed. As the column moved into the Owyhee country, the surface of the land changed from the low, rolling ground near the river to broken basalt benches cut by ravines. Snow lay in shallow drifts in some places and in deep, wind-packed banks in others. Horses slipped on hidden ice. Men went down, rose, and pushed on because the order said they would not turn back unless the enemy had been struck. At night they scraped out shallow pits in the lee of rocks, laid canvas or blankets over them, and tried to sleep with the wind tearing at exposed skin. Coffee boiled black in soot-covered kettles, and hard bread froze if left unattended too long. Scouts brought word of a large winter camp in a basin where willow thickets lined a half-frozen stream. Smoke from low lodges had drawn narrow trails into the surrounding brush. Women and children moved between shelters and woodpiles. Most warriors had stacked their rifles within easy reach, expecting cold but not an attack. Before dawn, Crook had his infantry moving quietly to block the nearest exits from the basin while the cavalry dismounted and led their horses along routes that brought them close to the lodges without showing silhouettes against the sky. The order to advance went down the line as a series of gestures and short whispers rather than a shouted command. The first shots broke the frozen quiet like boards snapping. Men surged forward, some stumbling over brush hidden beneath the snow. Warriors scrambled for weapons, some firing from doorways, others sprinting for boulders and downed logs at the edge of the camp. Mothers grabbed children and tried to pull them away from the shooting, only to find soldiers closing in from multiple directions. Dogs barked and then fell silent as bullets caught them. Horses screamed when stray rounds hit them in the confusion. Smoke from black powder hung low, mixing with the steam of breath and the vapor from the stream until the basin smelled of sulfur, blood, and cold mud. The clash was close and ugly, the kind of fight where a man could see the face of the person he was about to shoot. Some of the younger soldiers hesitated when they recognized that many of the figures in front of them were women or boys barely older than the buglers at Fort Boise. Others pushed ahead, driven by months of hearing accounts of massacres and stock thefts along the roads. Warriors who got clear of the lodges fired from scattered cover, trying to open a path for their families. As more of them fell, the resistance stiffened around a few clusters of rock and brush, men firing until their last rounds were gone and then trying to break out with knives or clubs. When the shooting died down, the basin lay covered with bodies, torn lodges, scattered goods, and the remains of fires that had been kicked apart. Soldiers moved among the fallen, looking for wounded who might rise and shoot again. Others gathered prisoners, mostly women and children who had thrown down their weapons or had never carried any. The faces of the captives showed a mixture of shock, grief, and hatred that needed no translation. Crook walked through the wreckage with his coat buttoned to the throat, boots dark with mud and blood, taking in every detail. He understood that this kind of blow would hurt the bands involved, but he also knew that it would drive surviving warriors to seek revenge. The only way to keep his own men alive, in his view, was to keep the pressure constant so that no single band could recover its strength. Over the following weeks, the column kept moving rather than returning to the post. They struck smaller camps, destroyed caches of dried food, and drove off or shot horses that could be used in future raids. Men moved in a haze of fatigue. Beards grew wild, clothes stiffened with sweat that had frozen and thawed again. Frostbite bit into fingers that fumbled during late-night sentry duty. Those who lost feeling in toes or ears looked at the darkening skin with quiet dread, knowing that rot could cost them limbs. Yet the orders never changed. They were to stay in the field through the worst of winter to show that no season would protect bands who had been attacking roads and settlements. In the camps of the bands that escaped, survivors told what they had seen. They described soldiers pushing into snow and cutting through cold that had once shielded winter lodges. They described the use of allied native scouts who could follow tracks even under light drifts and who knew how to read the pattern of smoke against clouds to find hidden camps. They described the taking of prisoners and the killing of horses that would have been needed for spring movement. The message ran along kin networks and visiting ties from one valley to another that the new officer in charge did not fight according to earlier seasonal patterns. With the winter campaign still echoing across the basins, Crook turned his attention toward the south and west, toward places where the district lines of different departments met and where responsibility had often been blurred. Orders and requests passed between Fort Boise and higher headquarters, discussing the need to reach toward the chain of lakes and ridges that lay between the Pitt River and the Oregon border. That country, anchored by a new post site to be called Camp Warner, formed a bridge between the northern operations Crook had already begun and the troubled region of Goose Lake and the Warner Mountains that had long fed men and horses into fights farther south. Camp Warner itself sat on a high plateau where wind cut through every gap in the low buildings. The soldiers who garrisoned it faced isolation more than direct attack. Supplies came in slowly over rough tracks that wagons chewed into ruts. When Crook visited, he saw men wrapped to the eyes in scarves, standing guard over lines of horses that shifted and stamped against the cold. From that height, he could look out toward distant ranges and dried lake beds that marked routes no map in his office had ever fully captured. Each ridge and cut represented another possible path for bands to move between Oregon and Northern California, between the Snake Country and the Pitt River Basin. He sent out smaller columns from Camp Warner as the weather began to ease, using mixed detachments of infantry and cavalry that had learned during the winter marches how to travel lean. They carried enough supplies for days at a time and depended on pack trains that followed with extra rations and ammunition. Scouts rode ahead, reading sign in dust and loose soil instead of snow. These spring and summer movements aimed not at one decisive battle but at constant harassment. Camps found in secluded draws were broken up. Food stores carefully placed for future use were burned or carried off. Groups of families on the move were diverted from their planned routes, forced into less favorable ground. In the settlements that linked to these operations only through rumor and the occasional arrival of a courier, the effect showed up as a slight decrease in attacks on coaches and wagon trains. Drivers still kept shotguns across their knees and passengers still looked nervously at every rise along the road. But some stretches that had felt like certain death now passed without incident. Ranchers noticed that stock stolen in some raids was recovered more often as patrols followed fresh tracks and caught up with small parties trying to drive animals across open country. The sense that the army at last had a commander who understood how to keep pressure on the bands involved spread quietly among civilians who had grown used to disappointment. For the bands that had once coordinated raids across wide distances, the new pressure created different kinds of strain. Messengers traveling between distant groups had to move carefully, knowing that patrols might appear in places that had previously been safe. Camps that had once been used year after year in the same season had to be abandoned or used for shorter periods. Some leaders began to doubt that they could continue to strike heavily trafficked roads without drawing dangerous pursuit into the heart of their remaining territories. Others, angrier and less willing to bend, argued that if they could draw Crook and his men far enough away from their main posts and deep enough into the hardest ground, they might still inflict a defeat that would slow the pressure. By the middle of 1867, Crook's report spoke of bands scattered, camps destroyed, and food stores burned, but they did not claim that resistance had ended. He understood that killing men in winter lodges and driving families into rougher ground did not erase the memory of settlements burned, relatives slain, and lands taken. He also knew that every time his scouts lost a trail in broken lava, or his advance guard rode into unexpected fire from rocks above, his own column came close to disaster. The country itself remained the strongest weapon in the hands of those who knew every ridge and hollow. News of one particular attack reached him in that atmosphere of strained advantage. A party of miners moving eastward, hoping to reach distant diggings, had been killed on the way, their animals taken and their bodies left where they fell. The killing did not happen in the Owyhee Basin he had just scoured, but farther south, near the routes that edged past Goose Lake and the stretches of basalt and broken ground that had long formed the back country of the Pitt River and neighboring peoples. The reports named no surviving witnesses, only the grim tally of dead and missing. Crook took those accounts at a table where maps of his district overlapped with charts from the adjoining department. His finger moved along the sketched line of the trail the miners had taken, across the high ground and down toward the basins that fed into northern California. He could see, even on paper, how a determined band might wait along those routes, strike, and then slip away into lava beds and hidden ravines that had provided refuge for generations. The same mind that had decided to attack winter camps rather than wait for spring now measured distances between posts, waterholes, and likely hiding places farther south. In the end, he did not treat the massacre as a problem for some other command. He ordered preparations for a new expedition that would start from the north, move down past Goose Lake, and search out the bands believed to be responsible. The force he began to assemble would include cavalry, infantry, native scouts, and civilian teamsters, a column built from the lessons of the previous winter and spring. Men at Camp Warner and other posts watched as animals were gathered, wagons loaded, and ammunition boxes checked. They understood that this new movement would carry them into country where very few white soldiers had gone in strength, and where the people they pursued could use stone, shadow, and narrow passages as weapons. The path that would lead toward the dark mouths of the lava caves near what settlers would later call Infernal Caverns began with that decision. Made over maps in a cold room where the wind rattled the window frames and the land to the south waited silent and unbroken. Early in September 1867, the column that George Crook had pulled together in the Goose Lake country left the last fenced fields behind and moved onto the high volcanic tableland that spread south and west toward the Pitt River. The line of march stretched out behind the advance scouts, first the loose file of Warm Springs and Shoshone riders, then detachments of the 1st Cavalry, then the plodding ranks of the 23rd Infantry with their boots grinding dust and gravel, and finally the clanking, swaying pack train that carried food, ammunition, and tools. Counting every trooper, scout, and enlisted man, the fighting strength hovered around 110 soldiers backed by about 15 native scouts and the civilian packers who tried to keep the column moving. Goose Lake dropped behind them as a long band of water in a faulted basin surrounded by ridges. Ahead lay country that did not offer easy ways through. The Modoc Plateau rose in steps of old lava, some covered with thin soil and sagebrush, others bare and broken. Juniper clustered where water lay closer to the surface. In between, open stretches gave no shade and almost no fuel. Each day's route had to be laid out so that animals could reach some kind of water by evening. O'Neill and the other packers worked with officers and scouts to trace lines between seeps, springs, and small creeks that would not leave the mules blown out and useless before the column ever reached its main objective. Every morning began with the same sequence. Bugles or shouted orders pulled men from blankets stiff with frost or damp from night dew. Fires caught along the edges of camp, coffee boiled, hard bread and meat disappeared in minutes. Saddles went onto horses and mules, cinches were tightened, and loads were checked with practiced hands. Infantrymen rolled their blankets, slung haversacks and cartridge boxes, and fell in with rifles stacked at reach. The scouts were usually mounted and moving before dawn, gray fully turned to daylight, feeling forward through the dim light to see whether any sign of recent passage lay on the next stretch of ground. The closer the column came to the lava country around the upper Pit River and the approaches to Goose Lake from the south, the more often sign appeared. A scrap of peeled bark near a seep, fresh ash where small fires had burned, a circle of stones still holding warmth under a thin layer of dust, tracks cutting across hard ground where no recent wagon wheels had passed. All told the same story. Families and fighters from Paiute, Pit River, and near groups had been moving through the same country in the days and nights before Crook's advance reached it. Sometimes the scouts found where a camp had held more people than a small raiding party, with many footprints of women and children as well as men, and places where poles had supported shelters. Those larger gatherings had already shifted away, leaving only faint marks and a few overlooked bits of broken pottery or worn leather. Crook studied each report in the short breaks he allowed. He knew the column was following people who had already shown what they could do to a large group of armed miners caught in exposed country. He also understood that if the bands he hunted were pressed too hard in open ground, they would fall back on areas where years of knowledge and old preparations gave them strong advantages. He had read earlier accounts and listened to men who knew the region well enough to describe pockets where lava had been shaped into natural redoubts, and where stone walls rose above narrow defiles. Somewhere ahead, the bands responsible for the recent killings and older raids would choose such a place and wait. For the native families and fighters retreating ahead of the soldiers, the trail south and west from Goose Lake did not feel like simple flight. It followed routes that had carried people for generations between seasonal grounds. One of those routes led toward a stretch of broken rock and caverns that had served in earlier years as both gathering place and refuge. There, old lava had cooled in thick layers and cracked, leaving deep cuts, shelves, and hollow spaces. Over time, warriors had added to what the land already offered. Stones had been stacked into firing lines that connected larger boulders and outcrops. Openings along the upper sides of a narrow ravine had been shaped into positions from which a person could watch and fire while staying protected by rock on three sides. The bands moving toward that ground knew its details. Older men recalled seasons when people had come there for fishing in nearby streams and for gatherings that had nothing to do with guns. Younger fighters had learned where each ledge ran, how the tunnels and tubes linked one pocket of cover to another, and where a person could slip from one level to the next without being seen from below. Some of the breastworks had been built long before Crook ever entered the region, for protection in older conflicts and as a precaution in unsettled times. Now those defenses were renewed. Stones that had fallen from place were lifted back into position. Loose rock was cleared from firing spots where it might shift under feet or knees at the wrong moment. Leaders from Paiute, Pit River, and other closely tied groups chose who would hold which part of the formation. Men skilled with rifles took the highest niches where they could see the most and command longer shots. Others who carried smoothbores more accurate at short range settled into positions closer to the funnels through which an enemy would have to pass if it pressed forward. Bows and arrows, still in use among some families, would work well from close overhead positions when attackers moved directly under the cliffs. Women and older children helped to carry water and food into the protected spaces behind the lines. Knowing that once fighting began, leaving those shelters would be dangerous, families who could not fight, the very young and the very old, stayed deeper in the caverns and hollows that tunneled into the rock. While defensive positions were being readied, Chio and Sieta, prominent among the leaders of the hostile bands, kept scouts out along the routes to the north and east. Those watchers saw the dust of Crook's column days before the soldiers came within rifle range of the stronghold. They counted estimates of how many mounted troopers and how many foot soldiers marched with him. They noted the small group of allied native scouts riding ahead and on the flanks. They followed at a distance from heights and hollows, using knowledge of side paths to keep contact without being driven into a single place too soon. Each report confirmed that the soldiers were determined to press on rather than fall back to safer posts. Inside the marching column, officers worked on how to keep the men ready for a fight that could come at any time. First cavalry troopers checked saddles, bridles, carbines, and revolvers whenever the column halted. Infantrymen of the 23rd inspected the percussion caps and nipples on their long guns and made sure cartridge boxes stayed dry. Orders reminded everyone to carry full canteens whenever possible. Ammunition wagons and pack mules stayed nearer to the center than they might have in more settled country. No one wanted to be caught in broken ground with empty cartridge belts and reserve boxes miles behind. Warm Springs and Shoshone scouts did more than simply ride in front. They walked the edges of ravines, crawled to ridges to peer over, and slid into shallow cuts to check whether recent fires had burned there. They recognized signs that white soldiers did not, such as where moss had been scraped from rock to use as padding under loads, or where certain shrubs had been cut for bedding. They also knew what it meant for local bands to converge on a particular stretch of unusual ground. When they began to see more concentrated tracks leading toward the same general direction, they understood that their enemies were preparing to stand rather than merely harass and slip away. Days of movement brought the column into the faulted country south of Goose Lake and east of the Pit River valleys, an area marked on maps only in broad strokes. On the ground, older lava flows had broken into stepped ridges and hollows. Some hollows held pockets of soil where grass grew in thin mats. Others were bare down to black or gray rock, with cracks that could swallow a person out of sight. Occasional juniper or pine offered scant shade. In some places, surfaces were flat enough to move over at decent speed. In others, horses and mules had to pick their way carefully around sharp fragments that could lame them with one wrong step. The last part of the approach brought Crook's men within range of the place later called Infernal Caverns or Hell Caves, without most of them yet knowing it by any name. From a distance, the formation looked like a rough stretch of broken bluffs above a shallow valley. As the scouts and then small officer parties went closer, more detail appeared. The valley floor narrowed where old flows had pushed in from both sides. Above that narrowing, rock shelves and protruding masses formed a stepped face that rose more sharply than it had seemed earlier. Dark openings showed under some of the shelves. In other spots, straight drops vanished into crevices whose bottoms were not visible from above. Crook did not march the entire column straight against that face the moment it came into clearer view. He ordered camps thrown up in positions that gave some cover from the higher ground, while the scouts and selected officers took closer looks. Lieutenant William Parnell, leading the cavalry detachment, and Lieutenant John Madigan of the infantry took turns going forward with small escort parties to study the slopes, openings, and possible routes of advance. They had to do this under the knowledge that hostile eyes watched them from somewhere among the rocks, even when no shots were fired. From vantage points that allowed at least partial views into the complex, the officers and scouts saw evidence of prepared defenses. In several places, stones had been stacked into low walls that did not match natural patterns of breakage. In others, brush had been dragged into slots and crevices, hiding the depth behind. Trails with fresh scuff marks led up toward those positions from the rear, indicating that defenders could move between levels without exposing themselves to fire from below. Smoke from cooking fires drifted at times from vents and openings set back from the lip of the ravine, not from any camp on the open ground. The scouts also reported sound. At certain hours, when the wind dropped, carried voices could be heard from within the rock labyrinth, not clearly enough to understand words but distinct enough in tone to show that many people occupied the complex. The mixture of deeper and higher voices indicated the presence of families as well as fighters. Crook understood that if he attacked the position, he would not be engaging only men armed for war. He would be driving into a place where non-combatants had taken shelter behind the same walls that would soon be firing positions. As more reports came in, Crook measured them against what he knew of his own strength and the terrain. The column carried enough ammunition and provisions for a short series of hard fights, not for a long siege far from established supply posts. The stronghold ahead could not be left alone, because it commanded routes between the Modoc Plateau and the country nearer settled valleys, and because the bands inside it had already shown they would strike at travelers on those routes when they judged conditions favorable. To withdraw after coming this far would invite more attacks on freight, stages, and isolated ranches, and would waste the effort that had brought his command out of Goose Lake. Inside the caverns and behind the stone lines, the defenders were making their own calculations. They knew the soldiers had halted and that more men than usual moved in the forward parts of the camp, which suggested planning. They could see that the column included both mounted and foot soldiers and that the pack train had been positioned so that it could be brought forward or pulled back as needed. Some fighters wanted to strike the camps at night before the soldiers grew fully familiar with the immediate ground. Others argued that the stone positions offered their best chance to inflict greater casualties, and that they should wait for the soldiers to commit themselves to the slopes and ravine where men and horses could not move easily. Crook's final orders on the eve of the main encounter reflected the same awareness of risk. Infantry companies were told to be ready to move at first light toward assigned sectors of the slope. Cavalrymen prepared to dismount and fight on foot if necessary, holding horses to the rear where they would not be obvious targets. Ammunition details checked pack loads and made sure that extra rounds would be available close behind the assault elements rather than left in a distant bivouac. Warm Springs and Shoshone scouts received instructions on where to lead and where to screen, knowing that their knowledge of rough ground would be critical when the regular troops began climbing into unfamiliar cuts and ledges. In the soldiers' camps that night, fires were kept low and small. Men spoke in quieter tones than usual, some checking straps and cartridge pouches a second and third time, others sitting with their backs against rocks and trying to sleep despite the tightness in their stomachs. Those who had already seen fights against entrenched positions in other campaigns understood that the ground ahead would dictate much of what happened once the first shots were fired. Those who had not yet faced that kind of action looked at the dark line of rock that cut the horizon and tried to imagine what waited inside its folds and openings. Within the lava fortress, defenders also waited through the hours of darkness. Some rested in the deeper hollows where the air stayed still and cool, curled around weapons. Others lay near the front edges of the breastworks, eyes adjusted to any change in the starlit shapes below. Paths inside the caves carried quiet movement as water and food were passed to those who would be in the most exposed positions when daylight returned. Leaders checked again that each key firing place was manned, that routes of withdrawal into deeper corridors remained clear, and that families who could not fight stayed back from any opening where bullets or fragments of stone might reach them. By the time dawn approached on 26 September, the opposing sides were already within reach of one another. The soldiers in their temporary camps on the lower ground, the native fighters in and above the ravine that cut into the lava formation. The land between them contained no settlements, no outside witnesses, only the edges of the Modoc Plateau and the dark shapes of the rocks that would soon have to be taken or held. On the night of 25 September 1867, Crook's men lay down closer to those rocks than they had ever been, while the people inside the caverns settled into positions they had chosen long before, each side committed by that point to seeing the confrontation through. By midsummer of 1867, the roads that ran out of the Sacramento and Willamette valleys carried more than freight and passengers. They carried rumor and calculation. Talk in saloons and assay offices turned again and again to the same plan. The rush in some districts had cooled, new diggings had opened farther east, and men who had already chased gold once decided to chase it again. One large party of miners chose to leave the relative familiarity of California and Oregon camps and push toward the Colorado country. Following overland tracks that crossed the same high plateaus and dry basins where the Snake War had been burning for several seasons. The men who joined that company came from scattered outfits. Some had worked river bars in Northern California and grown tired of thin returns. Others had tried their luck in the Boise Basin or the Owyhee diggings and decided that talk of richer finds in Colorado justified the risk of another long march. They gathered in numbers that set them apart from the small groups of freighters and travelers usually seen on the road. More than 70 men intent on making the journey together with their tools, bedrolls, and supplies. They trusted that such a size would deter attack. The same number that made them feel secure made them an obvious target to those watching from the ridges. Their route took them across land that did not look on a map the way it felt underfoot. On paper, the line curved in a broad arc between known valleys, skirting the Warner Mountains and the Goose Lake Basin, then reaching out toward the dry interior beyond. On the ground, the party moved through long stretches of sagebrush steppe broken by low ridges of basalt, shallow draws, and occasional scattered timber along minor watercourses. Dust hung in the air on dry days. Nights dropped into hard cold even in summer. Water came from springs, seeps, and small creeks whose locations had been marked in earlier years, by emigrant trains and by native families long before that. Every camp demanded effort. Animals had to be watered, hobbled, or picketed. Tents or simple windbreaks had to be thrown up in whatever shelter the land offered. Cooking fires drew down precious fuel gathered from stunted willows or deadfall. The miners passed evenings talking about the work ahead of them in distant diggings, counting imaginary returns, and comparing the hazards they had already survived on earlier trails. Some had heard about fights between soldiers, volunteers, and native bands in the Owyhee and Boise country. Others had followed only the edges of such news and treated it as something that happened to other people on other roads. Along the same route, native scouts had been watching the increase in traffic with a sharper eye. Word of this new company, larger than most, passed between camps of northern Paiute and allied people who still moved across the Modoc Plateau and the basins near the Oregon and California border. The presence of so many armed strangers bound for distant mineral fields did not appear as an abstract question of routes and borders. It appeared as yet another large intrusion passing through lands where grazing, water, and game had already been reduced by earlier waves of travel and settlement. Leaders and younger fighters discussed what this new movement meant and whether allowing such a large party to pass unchallenged would invite more of the same. The decision to strike did not come from impulse. It grew from seasons of watching the roads and counting the cost of restraint. The raiding party that assembled on the ridges near the miners' route included men who had learned through hard experience how fast soldiers could move from certain posts, how long it took for word of an attack to travel, and which stretches of country lay beyond quick reach of garrisons. They chose ground away from the fixed stations and nearer to the interior, where distance and broken land would slow any organized response. The place they settled on offered more than cover. It gave them angles of fire, concealment among rocks, and paths of withdrawal that could carry them into deeper country if the fight drew out. On the day of the attack, the miners' column moved as it had on many earlier days, with men spread along the line of march, some on foot, some mounted, and animals strung out along the track. The sun stood high enough to flatten shadows. Heat came off the rock and soil in waves that made distant features shimmer. From the miners' perspective, the land ahead seemed open, a shallow basin with low rises on either side and no obvious obstacles. From the vantage points chosen by the raiders, the same basin had edges that hid men lying behind rock, brush, and uneven ground, each position selected so that a rifle could be steadied, and a line of fire swept the route below. The first warning for the men in the road was not a shouted challenge, but the flat crack of rifles fired from above and ahead. Animals reared and plunged as bullets hit. Men dropped where they stood or sprawled from saddles. Those who still held their feet or kept their seats looked for the source of the fire and saw only flashes, smoke, and brief glimpses of figures behind stone. Some tried to reach cover along the margins of the track, but the same low ridges that had hidden the attackers left little shelter at ground level. Weapons that had been carried more as symbols of readiness than as tools suddenly became central. Miners who managed to find any cover at all worked ramrods, capped nipples, or cocked revolvers with hands made clumsy by shock. Shots answered the first volleys, scattered and often wild because few targets presented themselves for long. The raiders, firing from prepared positions, controlled the rhythm of the fight. Some concentrated on dropping animals, knowing that without stock the party could neither travel nor carry supplies even if it survived. Others aimed at men who seemed to be giving orders or directing movement, trying to tear out any center of resistance. The scene on the road turned quickly into chaos. Animals broke loose and ran in blind terror, some crashing into one another, some falling with broken legs or bullet wounds that left them thrashing on the ground. Men tried to rise from the dirt where they had thrown themselves, only to be knocked flat again by impacts they barely had time to feel. Shouts overlapped as men called for more ammunition, for someone to help a wounded friend, for others to pull back from areas swept by fire. There was no prepared plan for such a fight and no ground chosen in advance for defense. Every decision had to be made under immediate pressure, with little information beyond the knowledge that fire was coming from above and from more than one side. Some small knots of miners managed to form what passed for defensive positions, piling packs or saddles, crouching behind low mounds or shallow cuts and firing at any movement on the heights. In those pockets of stubbornness, men reloaded and shot until powder horns ran empty and cartridge pouches grew light. They saw comrades hit and could not move them out of the line of fire. They felt the air twitch near their faces and hands as bullets missed by narrow margins. Those who fell sometimes did so in silence, sometimes with sounds that cut through the other noise of the fight. For the raiding party, the engagement took less time than it seemed to the men under fire. Once it became clear that organized resistance had collapsed in most of the column, the attackers began to shift their focus. Some continued to fire to keep survivors pinned in place. Others moved to close range where they could finish those who still moved and secure the stock that remained alive. Horses and mules that had not been hit were driven away from the road and gathered under guard. Anything of immediate use, such as weapons, ammunition, blankets, and food, was stripped from bodies and scattered packs. When the shooting ended, the stretch of road that had seemed open and unremarkable that morning lay dotted with bodies and debris. The smell of powder faded into the persistent odors of blood, dust, and animal sweat. If any of the miners escaped in the first minutes of the attack, slipping away on surviving horses or on foot, they did so under conditions that made their stories hard to trace. What became fixed in written accounts that later reached distant readers was the number of dead. Reports that traveled outward from the nearest settlements settled on a toll of 78 miners killed while traveling overland toward Colorado. The movement of that number through letters, dispatches, and newspapers turned a single massacre in remote country into a catalyst for wider action. At way stations along the roads, at trading posts, and in towns near the conflict zone, people spoke of the attack as proof that the war on the frontier was far from over. Merchants and mine owners saw more than individual tragedy. They saw the possibility that fear of similar attacks would choke off movement of labor and supplies. Families in scattered ranches saw a sign that no amount of local vigilance could replace a determined military campaign. Reports moved by telegraph and courier into the offices of department commanders and then into broader circulation. A New York paper carried the story, giving it a reach far beyond the valleys and basins where the bodies had fallen. To officers already engaged in hard campaigns against scattered bands, the massacre of 78 miners made it harder to argue for limited operations or for patience. To many civilian readers, it confirmed an image of the Snake War as a struggle in which settlers, miners, and travelers faced organized and relentless opposition from native fighters, determined to defend their remaining territories. For George Crook, already committed to winter and spring drives against bands in the Owyhee and Boise country, the news fit into a larger picture rather than standing alone. The miners' deaths underlined what he had already concluded, that allowing raiding parties to regroup and shift into new refugees would only move the problem from one set of roads to another. The location of the massacre, in or near a corridor that connected the northern basins to the country around Goose Lake and beyond, suggested that the bands involved could retreat southward into the Modoc Plateau and the chains of lava and broken rock that had long served as strongholds. When Crook moved his focus toward the Goose Lake region, he did so with the miners' fate fresh in mind, and with instructions that emphasized pursuit rather than passive defense. Goose Lake Valley, high and hemmed in by the Warner Mountains and the Modoc Plateau, became a forward base. Its faulted basin, with an alluvial floor and surrounding walls of basalt, gave him room to concentrate men and animals within range of the routes the hostile bands were likely to use. The old Applegate Trail and related cutoffs that crossed the southern end of the valley had once carried emigrant wagons west. Now the same approaches would carry troops south and east toward the country from which the raiders had come. Crook's command for this push gathered at and around the new and existing posts that anchored the northern edge of that region. Units of the 1st Cavalry and the 23rd Infantry provided the core. Their numbers, when assembled for the movement that would end at Infernal Caverns, reached roughly 110 soldiers. To that he added a small but vital contingent of Warm Springs and Shoshone scouts, about 15 native men whose loyalty lay with rival groups, and who knew how to read the land in ways that white officers never matched. Their presence gave the column eyes and ears that could catch faint tracks, distant smoke, and other signs of movement. The logistical backbone of the expedition required attention, as careful as any battle plan. Pack trains carried flour, bacon, coffee, ammunition, and tools. One of the men responsible for managing those loads and keeping animals moving through rough country, a packer named John O'Neill, had roots in the Goose Lake country and would later settle permanently in that valley. For the moment, his job was to keep the column fed and supplied while it moved into lands where there were few settlements and no reliable depots. Every extra day the soldiers spent on the trail depended on how well that pack train performed. When the column set out from the Goose Lake region and began to angle south and west across the Modoc Plateau, the men could see for themselves why bands that knew the country could strike and vanish with such ease. The land rolled in long, dry swells broken by sudden ridges and cuts. Basalt flows had cooled into irregular shelves and low cliffs. Lava had once moved through the ground and left hollow spaces that age and weather had opened into caves and caverns. Sagebrush, scattered juniper, and thin grass gave some cover but not much forage. Water appeared in small springs and short streams whose courses did not always match what survey maps showed. Advanced scouts and flankers moved well ahead of the main body, checking each basin and ridge before the infantry and pack animals committed themselves. Trails used by native families could be narrow, winding, and hard to follow, yet those same paths offered the best access to water and passes. Signs of recent occupation appeared in places that would have seemed uninviting to men used to towns and farms. Old fire rings, piles of brush cut for windbreaks, and faint paths worn into the soil marked where families had camped. The absence of fresh sign did not guarantee safety because bands under pressure could shift quickly between prepared refuges. As the troops and scouts pressed farther into the plateau, the sense grew that the enemy was near but not eager to risk open battle on unfavorable ground. Tracks on hardpan and in dusty washes showed groups moving ahead of the column, sometimes splitting, sometimes coming together again farther on. Smoke seen late in the day on distant ridges faded before the soldiers drew close. Night trails revealed that families and fighters were using the darker hours to move away from the areas the army searched by day. Every mile closed the distance between the column and the people it sought, but it also pulled Crook's men deeper into a region where the land could act as an ally for those who understood it best. Among the formations that rose ahead were clusters of rock and broken lava that narrowed into steep-sided cuts and ravines. Some of these features looked from a distance like ordinary ridges. Only when the troops approached did the true complexity show, with overhangs, natural walls, and openings in the rock that reached back into the dark. It was toward one of these formations, a place of caverns, ledges, and hollow tubes in the lava, that the bands responsible for the miners' deaths in earlier raids finally chose to stand. The trap they intended to spring there would rely on more than numbers or weapons. It would rely on the land itself, shaped over ages into a killing ground where any force that believed it had the upper hand could discover too late that it had been drawn into a position of grave disadvantage. At first light, on 26 September 1867, the scouts who had watched the lava stronghold through the night came back to George Crook's small command with the same report from every vantage point. Smoke still seeped from vents and cracks high in the broken rock. Dark shapes moved behind stone breastworks, and the ravine below the main forts showed no sign that the bands inside had slipped away. The enemy remained in place inside the Infernal Caverns, confident enough in their position to wait for the soldiers to come to them. Crook formed his men for battle rather than for another day of marching. Companies of the 1st Cavalry were ordered to fight on foot, leaving a portion of troopers to hold the horses in protected ground to the rear. The 23rd Infantry companies would advance beside them over the rough plateau instead of staying in a compact block. The Warm Springs and Shoshone scouts received instructions to move wide, some circling toward the rear of the lava formation to watch for any attempt to escape toward the bluffs, others ranging along the flanks to keep hostile scouts from slipping around the column. The pack train, with its boxes of cartridges and sacks of rations, was drawn into a sheltered dip in the ground east of the plateau and left under a guard that included the quartermaster officer, Lieutenant Eskridge, and a handful of enlisted men. The ground ahead dictated how the line would look once it moved. The plateau that jutted from the main wall of basalt rose in a double slope from the valley, first through patches of coarse grass and scattered juniper, then across fields of angular rock where horses could no longer walk. Higher up, the surface broke into irregular knobs and shallow hollows. Near the top, the land suddenly fell away into a ravine that curved in front of the main Indian forts. That ravine cut deep enough that its floor lay well below the platforms where the defenders had built stone walls and firing positions. Around the ravine's outer edge, natural ledges and outcrops gave cover to anyone willing to crawl from boulder to boulder. Within that maze of rock, the defenders finished their own preparations as the soldiers formed up below. Chio and Sieta, whose names had already been carried through frontier posts as leaders in earlier raids, assigned men to 3 layers of defense. The first line occupied shallow pits and natural hollows scattered across the upper slopes of the plateau, each one improved by loose stones pulled together into low parapets. From those positions, men with rifles could fire downslope and then fall back when pressure grew. The second line stood in the narrow corridors and ledges just behind the ravine's lip, watching over the approaches that any attacker would have to use to reach the main forts. The third and strongest line stayed behind the built walls on the inner platforms, looking out through loopholes cut between piled rocks. Women, older people, and children moved deeper into the caves and tubes that ran back into the plateau, out of sight but close enough to hear the leaders' voices. By mid-morning, Crook gave the signal to advance. Thin lines of infantry and dismounted cavalry started up the lower slope, keeping several paces between men so that a single volley could not wipe out a cluster. Warm Springs scouts slipped ahead in pairs, picking paths through the scattered stones and marking spots where larger groups could follow. The air was still and clear enough that every movement sent dust into the light. From the soldiers' point of view, the upper ground seemed empty except for rock. No flags showed, no clusters of heads, nothing that resembled fortifications until the lines climbed higher and the angle of view changed. The first shot came from the plateau, not from the troops. A rifle spoke from a hollow above the left wing and a trooper dropped without a sound, rolling down slope with his carbine sliding free of his hands. A second shot cracked from the opposite side, followed by a third and fourth, until the scattered openings that dotted the upper ground flashed in sequence. Bullets hummed and chipped rock around the advancing lines. Men instinctively bent low, seeking cover among boulders and shallow cuts that only partly shielded them. Orders to lie down and return fire raced along the line, but many could not see exactly where the attackers were hidden. As the firefight grew, First Sergeant Charles Brackett of the cavalry moved along his section of the line, trying to steady men who had been pinned in place by fire from several directions. He had served long enough to know that hesitation on an open slope could be fatal, so he shouted for his file to keep inching forward from one rock to the next, firing only when they could pick a solid outline behind a parapet. A bullet struck him as he rose just enough to look for the next piece of cover, and he fell where he stood, his men dragging him a few feet back behind a stone shelf that offered only a brief barrier against further fire. Nearby, Private James Lyons took a round while trying to bring extra cartridges to a clutch of men low on ammunition. He collapsed with the leather pouch still in his hand, cartridges spilling out across the dirt and rock. In the first hard minutes of that engagement, the soldiers understood that the plateau held far more prepared positions than anyone had seen from a distance. Each low pile of stone or irregularity in the surface could hide a rifle barrel. The defenders used their familiarity with every fold and gap to shift positions, firing from one hollow, then sliding back to another while the troops below aimed at the first. Warm Springs scouts who had seen similar ground in their own homelands called out directions in their own languages and in broken English, pointing out gun flashes that others had missed. Some of them climbed higher than the regulars on narrow paths, taking up firing positions on side ridges where they could shoot diagonally across the plateau and into pits that faced the front. The fight settled into a grinding pattern that lasted through the afternoon. The 23rd Infantry, with their long arms, tried to pin down rifle pits on one flank while the dismounted cavalry pushed up on the other. Men reloaded behind rocks, then leaned out to fire a careful shot before ducking back. Powder smoke gathered in low patches wherever air failed to move it away, making it harder for both sides to see clearly. Wounded men called for water or for help to reach safer positions, but many had to stay where they fell until the fire slackened enough for someone to crawl to them. No one on either side could risk standing upright for more than a moment. On the defenders' side, Chio and Sieta kept pressure on the attackers by ordering small groups to hold each pit as long as they could, then move to the next without turning the withdrawal into a rush. When one position became untenable under concentrated fire, its occupants slid back along paths that only they knew, crossing behind larger boulders and ducking into cuts that led toward the ravine. From there they climbed to new hollows or took places behind the main walls. The first line was not meant to stand forever, only to slow Crook's approach and make him pay for each stretch of ground. Gradually, under the weight of persistent fire and the steady push of the infantry, the outer pits fell quiet. In some, bodies lay among spent cartridges and shattered rock. In others, only a few drops of blood and disturbed soil showed where defenders had fought and then slipped away. By late afternoon, soldiers on both wings had reached points where they could look down into empty rifle pits that had been dangerous only an hour earlier. The advance had not been quick, but it had succeeded in forcing the first line back from the plateau edge toward the ravine and the forts beyond. Crook took in this new position from a vantage point that gave him a partial view of the ravine and the stoneworks on the inner platforms. He could see men moving behind the walls, but not in enough detail to count them. He ordered pickets with the best long-range rifles to settle in behind substantial rocks on the outer lip of the ravine. Their task was to keep up a steady fire on any defender who showed too much of himself above the parapets, to remind the people inside that the soldiers now held the surrounding high ground. Other men were told to strengthen their own makeshift positions along the rim with whatever loose stone they could drag into place. From inside the forts, the change in the fight looked different. Families who had taken shelter deeper in the caverns heard reports that the outer pits were no longer safe, that men had been lost holding them, and that soldiers now crouched above the ravine where only defenders had stood before. The air inside the lava tubes grew thick with the smell of smoke, drifting in from the gunfire outside, mingled with the odors of sweat, unwashed clothing, and the damp rock itself. Medicine men chanted and shook rattles in darkened chambers, trying to steady hearts that had heard the thud of bullets striking rock near openings where children waited. Chio and Sieta moved between firing positions, telling men to hold their shots until they had clear targets on the rim and to be ready for a push into the ravine if the soldiers tried to cross. As the sun slid lower, the first strain of the day's fight began to tell on both sides. Crook ordered small groups of soldiers to withdraw in turn from the heights down to the valley camp, long enough to drink, eat cold rations, refill cartridge boxes, and bring up water for comrades who remained on the plateau. Men went down with faces blackened by powder and dust, shoulders bruised from rifle recoil and contact with rough rock, and clothes torn by the climb and by splinters from near misses. After a short rest, they climbed back to their places on the rim, unwilling to leave the line thinner in case the enemy tried a sudden charge out of the ravine. Light faded, but the fighting did not stop completely. When darkness covered the plateau, both sides relied on flashes and sounds. Soldiers fired at the brief sparks of rifles discharging from behind the stone walls. Defenders sent occasional volleys toward the rim, hoping to find targets by sheer volume. Voices carried clearly in the cooler night air. Men on the plateau heard chanting and shouted encouragement from within the caverns, words they could not always understand, but tones that left no doubt that the people inside remained defiant. At intervals, small groups of native fighters slipped out of side entrances beneath the cliffs and moved low across the broken ground toward the valley camp, firing into the shadows around the horse herd and pack animals. The guards there returned fire, and Lieutenant Eskridge had to keep his small detachment alert through the night to prevent a stampede that would have crippled the entire command. Near the rim, officers checked on their men by touch as much as by sight, crawling from rock to rock to make sure no one had fallen asleep at his position. Lieutenant William Parnell and Lieutenant John Madigan talked with Crook about how the ravine might be crossed and which sections of the wall could be reached if men found a way down and up the far side. They understood from the day's work that any assault would have to navigate steep, broken faces that offered few secure handholds. From what they could see, the natural moat around the main fortifications was deep and narrow, with only a few spots where it might be possible to drop down without breaking bones. In the soldiers' camp, the dead from the day's fighting were laid out and covered as best conditions allowed. Wounded men were settled where surgeons and hospital stewards could reach them with bandages, water, and such medicines as the column carried. The names of Brackett and Lyons passed quietly from mouth to mouth, added to the list of comrades lost in earlier fights along the long Snake War trail. Around cookfires kept small for safety, men spoke of how far they had come from the posts near Goose Lake, and of how close they now felt to ending one more hard campaign. From their perspective, the day had driven the enemy off the open plateau and into a confined hollow of rock. Crook took the same view when he weighed the results of the engagement. The outer rifle line had been stripped away. The plateau that had first looked unassailable now held clusters of his own men instead of scattered Indian pits. The defenders had been pushed back into a stronghold that seemed surrounded by rifles on the rim and watched from the rear by Warm Springs scouts. It looked on the surface as if another day's hard push would break the last resistance and finish the work that had begun when the column left Goose Lake. What Crook and most of his officers could not yet see in full was the interior shape of the fortress they had pressed their opponents into. The ravine walls, the hidden paths between the forts, and the depth of the caverns meant that the people inside still controlled a defensive system designed to punish any force that tried to cross the open drops and climb into the stone enclosures. As men on both sides tried to rest in short snatches through the night of 26 September, many of the soldiers believed that the worst of the fighting lay behind them and that the enemy was boxed in. The fighters inside the caverns knew that the next day would bring the real test, when the attackers would be forced to descend into ground chosen and prepared long before any blue coats set foot on the plateau. On the morning of 27 September 1867, the plateau above the lava caverns lay under a flat gray light, and the men in blue who had held the rim through the night rose stiff and sore to orders that told them the hardest work was still ahead. Along the edge of the ravine, soldiers of the 1st Cavalry and the 23rd Infantry lay behind stones they had dragged into position the day before. Below them, the dark cut in the rock curved around the Indian forts, its far wall lined with stacked stone and narrow openings that now showed no heads, no movement, nothing to shoot at. Smoke drifted faintly from vents higher up, the only clear sign that the stronghold remained fully occupied. Crook moved along the line with his coat buttoned and hat pulled low, talking briefly with officers at each cluster of men. His voice stayed even, but the orders it carried were not cautious. The enemy had been driven from the outer pits. The plateau positions now belonged to the command. The forts in the rock hollow were the last shelter between the bands inside and the open country beyond. They would not be allowed to slip away again. The ravine would be crossed and the walls taken. He directed Lieutenant William Parnell to prepare picked cavalrymen to lead one assault element, and Lieutenant John Madigan to collect infantry volunteers for another. Both detachments would go down into the cut and push up the opposite side, one slightly left, one slightly right, to find any weakness in the defenses. The troops selected for the first push checked weapons with more care than usual. Cavalry troopers slung carbines across their backs, checked that revolvers turned freely in their holsters, and tightened belt cartridges so they would not spill when they slipped or fell. Infantrymen ran fingers along the sights of their long rifles, felt for cracks in stocks, and made sure powder and caps stayed dry. Bayonets, rarely used in open fights along wagon roads, were fixed to some of the muskets in case the assault reached the walls. Allied scouts looked at the ravine edges and muttered to one another, tracing routes in the air with their hands as they tried to imagine how men unfamiliar with such ground would move once they committed themselves. From inside the caverns, Chio and Sieta watched the soldiers gathering on the rim. They could not hear every word, but they saw the pattern. Men were forming in tighter knots near points where the ravine narrowed. Movement among the blue-coated figures shifted from scattered to purposeful. The defenders had spent the night rechecking their own positions. Rifles were wiped down and loaded. Powder horns and cartridge pouches were filled from the limited supply of ammunition. Some men traded places so that those with the steadiest hands took the posts that commanded the steepest approaches. Behind the walls, runners had cleared paths through the interior so fighters could move quickly between levels and firing points, without crossing open mouths of caves that might draw bullets. Shortly after sunrise, Crook gave the signal. Parnell's group went first. The lieutenant stepped to the edge of the ravine with a handful of non-commissioned officers and scouts, then eased down onto a narrow ledge that sloped away from the plateau. Behind them came a string of troopers, each man lowering himself by hands and boots, trying not to dislodge loose stone. Farther along the rim, Madigan's infantry detachment began a similar descent along a second route that offered only marginal footing and almost no real cover. From the plateau, it looked as if the two spearheads were crawling into the throat of the hollow, one on either side of a central drop that fell straight to the bottom. For several long minutes, the only sounds were the scrape of boots, the clatter of small rocks knocked loose, and short commands muttered between men trying to keep their balance. No shots came from the walls above. Men on the rim held their breath and kept rifles trained on any opening they could see, ready to send suppressing fire the moment a defender showed himself. The silence seemed to some of the soldiers like evidence that the fight had gone out of the people in the caverns. To others, it felt like the held breath before a door slammed. The first rifle blast from the forts shattered that illusion. It came from a loophole almost directly opposite Parnell's path, followed instantly by a second and a crackling wave of fire that ran along the line of stoneworks from left to right. Bullets struck the rock face around the descending troopers, showering them with chips that cut skin even when lead missed flesh. One man on Parnell's left screamed and cartwheeled down the slope, carbine tumbling away from him as his body slid and bounced toward the ravine floor. Another clung to a slab with both arms while his legs dangled over empty space, his boots kicking against air as a sergeant tried to grab a wrist and haul him back onto some kind of foothold. Madigan's men on the other path took the same kind of fire from slightly different angles. Shots came not only from the main wall directly across from them, but also from slits in rock that had been invisible from above, angled around corners so that defenders could rake the slope without leaning out. The infantrymen tried to flatten themselves against the stone, but the surface offered little shelter. Some fired upward from where they clung, aiming at the same openings again and again. Others focused only on staying attached to the wall, teeth clenched as they moved one limb at a time. At the lip of the ravine, soldiers on the plateau answered with a heavy volley. Their rounds cracked over the heads of their own men and slammed into the opposite wall, sending shards of stone flying. That fire forced some defenders to duck away from the parapets, but not all. Experienced fighters knew when to expose themselves only for an instant, enough to fire, then drop back behind cover while the answering shots passed through empty air. Inside the caverns, boys and women carried extra ammunition from stores deeper in the rock to the men at the front, passing cartridges hand to hand along cramped corridors where the reports of each gunshot echoed and multiplied. Despite the storm of bullets, parts of the assault moved forward. Parnell and a knot of troopers under him reached a sloping shelf just above the ravine floor, broad enough for a few men to stand upright. From there they could see clearly how narrow and deep the cut ran, and how the opposite side rose almost sheer for many feet before breaking into ledges that led toward the main walls. The bottom of the ravine was a jumble of fallen stone, some pieces as large as wagons, others no bigger than a fist, all coated in dust and splinters from years of weather and the fresh battering of battle. Smoke pooled in the hollow, thick enough in places to sting eyes and burn throats. Madigan's detachment reached the floor in another sector, dropping the last short distance when their legs gave out. Men landed hard among the rocks, some twisting ankles, others banging knees or elbows. There was no time to tend minor injuries. The lieutenant pointed toward a jagged break in the far wall that looked slightly more climbable than the rest. He ordered men to move toward it in pairs, using large chunks of stone as partial cover. As they moved, they had to step over bodies of comrades who had fallen from above or been hit in the first seconds at the bottom. Some lay still. Others groaned and reached out, asking anyone who passed to pull them behind larger rocks. When the assault group started up the far side, the defenders turned their fire downward in earnest. Shots came almost straight down from firing slits and from the edges of the walls, kicking up dust at the climbers' feet and driving into flesh and bone when aim met target. The angle was so steep that some bullets hit rock and ricocheted unpredictably. Fragments and deflected rounds tearing into men who thought they had cover. In some spots, defenders rolled loose stones into the ravine, sending them crashing down the slopes. A boulder that might not have been lethal on its own became deadly when it knocked men off balance, pitching them into the air or slamming them into outcrops. The weapons on each side added to the brutality. Many of the soldiers carried rifled muskets, firing heavy lead bullets that punched deep holes when they struck. Some troopers had breech-loading carbines that could be worked faster, especially important when clinging to rock with limited freedom of movement. Revolvers at close range turned narrow corners into lethal spaces, the short barrels easier to bring to bear when bodies tangled. Among the defenders, better marksmen held captured repeaters and muzzle loaders taken in earlier raids, while others used older smoothbores and even bows, launching arrows downward from unseen perches where they could arc into the crowded ravine. Despite the conditions, small breakthroughs occurred. A handful of cavalrymen managed to reach a narrow shelf halfway up the far wall and flatten themselves against it, firing upward into the lower sections of a breastwork that had not been designed to resist shots from below. They chipped away mortar between stones and forced the men behind that segment to back off. On Madigan's flank, 2 squads of infantry pressed up a gully cut into the wall, using its curve to shield them from some of the direct fire. At close range, they lobbed rocks and grenade-like bundles of powder and scrap toward openings where defenders had been most active. The detonations shattered stone and sent fragments flying into faces and hands above. However, every step gained cost more men than the command could afford. Communications between the groups in the ravine and the officers on the rim broke down under the echoing noise and the complex shape of the ground. Runners had to scramble up and down slopes under fire, carrying messages that were already out of date by the time they reached their destinations. One non-commissioned officer sent to tell Crook that a section of wall might be taken disappeared in the attempt, later found among the dead in a crease near the bottom. Another made it as far as the upper ledge, exhausted and bleeding from a glance off his shoulder, gasping that his squad was pinned and nearly out of ammunition. On the plateau above, men watching through the smoke could see only fragments of the scene below. They saw bodies sliding down, saw shots coming from the walls, and heard the dull, heavy impacts when larger stones landed among their comrades. Some shouted to be allowed to go down and reinforce the assault, but Crook could not commit the entire command into ground where men could barely move, and casualties mounted with every minute. Instead, he ordered more intense fire from the rim, telling units along the entire arc of the ravine to maintain a constant volley at any loophole, crack, or edge where they glimpsed movement. Inside the caverns, defenders sensed that the assault had reached its highest point. They had taken losses. Several positions along the wall now held dead men whose places others had to fill. Blood streaked some stones, and the narrow passages behind the fortifications were littered with spent cartridge cases and patches of scorched moss from torches used to light deeper sections. Still, the structure of the defense held. No attacking group had yet forced its way into a firing chamber or onto the platforms in numbers that could not be met. Chio and Sieta directed short, sharp counterattacks along the interior paths, sending small parties to sally out of secondary openings to fire into the backs or flanks of men climbing in the gully where Madigan's troops pushed. Once those quick strikes had disrupted the attackers, the counterattackers slipped back into cover before the main body of soldiers could react. By late morning, the ravine floor had become a place of concentrated misery. Wounded men lay among the rocks, some calling for water, others silent and staring. The heat reflected from the stone made the air oppressive despite the elevation. Powder smoke hung stubbornly in pockets where the wind could not reach. Blood stained not only the rocks where men had fallen, but also the handholds and footholds along the slopes, making them slick and treacherous. Every attempt to shift position risked stepping or grabbing where flesh and stone had mixed. Crook took stock from his vantage point near the center of the rim. He saw how little distance the main assault groups had gained in hours of fighting. He judged from the constant stream of wounded being dragged or helped up the slopes that the detachments in the ravine had already lost a significant share of their men. He knew that ammunition could not be wasted, and that fatigue would soon render even unwounded soldiers less effective. Continuing to feed more men into the same confined space threatened to turn the ravine into a grave for half his command. Yet pulling back under fire would be as dangerous as pushing forward. The decision he made balanced those dangers. He ordered Parnell and Madigan to hold what ground they could until covering fire from the rim built to its heaviest, then to begin a staged withdrawal from the far wall back toward the plateau roots. Squads would alternate, one set keeping up fire while another moved, so that defenders could not simply rise and shoot men in the back as they climbed. Signal shots and shouted cues timed the start of this grim process. In the ravine, the order to fall back cut through the noise in fragments, but enough men heard it to start the movement. On Madigan's side, a group that had been pressed close to a section of wall emptied their last cartridges into the parapet, then began to slide and scramble down toward the floor, helping wounded comrades whose legs could not carry them. Above them, defenders fired as soon as heads and shoulders turned away, dropping several men before they reached the lower rocks. On Parnell's flank, troopers on the mid-level shelf covered their companions below, then retreated in turn, lowering themselves on boot tips and fingertips until they reached points where they could drop the last short distance. The climb back up to the plateau was slower and more punishing than the descent had been at dawn. Men dragged one another as far as they could before their own strength failed. Makeshift stretchers fashioned from rifles and jackets carried some of the worst cases. Others had to be left temporarily on small shelves, positioned as best their comrades could manage behind rocks that might shield them from direct fire until a second or third trip could reach them. Every yard gained cost more blood as the defenders continued to fire from advantageous angles. When the heads of the first, returning soldiers appeared over the rim, men on the plateau grabbed arms, belts, and equipment to haul them onto relatively level ground. Surgeons and stewards set up a dressing point just back from the edge, tearing cloth into bandages, cutting away uniforms around wounds, and doing what they could with limited supplies for shattered limbs and torn bodies. Those still capable of fighting, once they had caught breath and swallowed a few mouthfuls of water, often picked up rifles again and moved to fill gaps along the rim, too aware of the thinness of the line to rest. Inside the caverns, the defenders did not chase the retreating men into the open. They had no desire to expose themselves to the heavy fire still pouring from the plateau. Instead, they strengthened their walls where damage had shown, shifted fighters to replace those killed or disabled, and tended to their own wounded in the shadowed spaces behind the fortifications. The moans and low voices inside the lava tubes told of loss there as well, even if numbers did not match those mounting outside. Some families grieved quietly for fathers, brothers, or sons whose bodies lay among the rocks on the edges of the ravine or in the pits that had formed the outer line the previous day. By mid-afternoon, the direct assault had ended. The ravine still held bodies of men in blue who could not be reached under current fire and of defenders who had fallen from their own positions. The plateau rim remained in army hands lined with tired, powder-grimed soldiers watching the fortifications they had failed to carry. The bands inside the cavern still held the core of their position, having turned the land into the weapon they always believed it could be. As the sun dropped toward the horizon, the immediate gunfire slackened, but did not cease entirely. Shots still cracked at intervals, more to remind the other side of continued presence than to achieve decisive effect. Smoke thinned and lifted in the cooling air, revealing more of the broken terrain than had been visible during the height of the fight. From his command point, Crook could see the scars carved into both sides by the day's work, the shattered stone faces on the walls and the tracks of blood left on the slopes by men dragged up or down. In camp that evening, the cost of the assault became clear in human terms. Roll calls revealed missing men whose names were met with silence. Squads counted how many of their number now lay in the surgeon's care or in rows of bodies covered by blankets. Equipment officers noted empty spaces where carbines, muskets, and gear had belonged. Among the packers and teamsters, civilians who had marched with the soldiers into this harsh ground, there was the same tally of loss. Some had gone down in the ravine while helping carry ammunition or assisting wounded men. Their absence weighed heavily on comrades who had known them from earlier roads and camps. Within the caverns, defenders understood that they had inflicted a severe blow on the force outside, but they also knew that they could not stay in the stronghold forever. Ammunition and food remained finite. Children and elders could not endure a long siege. The trap they had created had worked in the sense that it had punished pursuers who believed the position nearly taken. Yet the enemy on the rim still possessed numbers, supplies, and the ability to call for support from distant posts. Night would come, and with it a choice whether to hold the lava fort another day or to use the same hidden passages and cracks that had allowed fighters to move between positions to take families and survivors out into the deeper reaches of the plateau. On that single day, 27 September 1867, both sides learned in full what the shape of the land could do when turned into a deliberate killing ground. The soldiers who had gone down into the ravine discovered that bravery and discipline could not erase the advantages built into stone. The fighters inside the cavern saw that even a prepared fortress could bleed under persistent assault. The trap had closed, and many men had paid for Crook's determination to crush his opponents inside their own stronghold. The command still held the heights, but the price of that control had been written bodies scattered from the plateau rim to the bottom of the ravine. Through the late afternoon of 27 September, the plateau above the cavern stayed under constant tension. The direct assault into the ravine had ended, but neither side treated the day as finished. Along the rim, men of the 1st Cavalry and the 23rd Infantry held their places behind rocks they had dragged into position, watching every visible loophole in the walls across the cut. Below them, the ravine still held soldiers who could not yet be moved, some dead, others clinging to consciousness, all lying among broken stone that recorded every step of the failed advance. Shots still snapped from the forts whenever a head or shoulder showed too clearly on the plateau. The soldiers answered with single-aimed rounds meant to keep defenders wary and away from the parapets. Rescue efforts began almost at once. Under covering fire from above, small parties were sent back down the same treacherous paths that had carried the assault that morning. Men tied extra cartridge boxes and canteens to their belts and went over the edge with empty stretchers fashioned from rifles and jackets. They moved cautiously, knowing that each yard covered would have to be climbed again with another man's weight added. When they reached wounded comrades on shelves or at the bottom, they worked in pairs and small groups to lift bodies over sharp projections, sometimes using belts and straps as makeshift slings. Every movement strained muscles already exhausted by hours of fighting. Occasionally, a rescuer slipped on blood-slick stone and slid several feet, tearing skin from hands and knees. Near the center of the work, stretcher parties reached Sergeant David Russler. He had taken his wounds close to the fighting in the ravine, and those wounds were grave. Surgeons later judged that he might survive the climb out but would not live long without care beyond what the field could offer. The men who reached him wrapped him as securely as they could and began the difficult haul back to the plateau and then down toward the valley camp. Close by, bodies of other non-commissioned officers and enlisted men lay where they had fallen. First Sergeant Charles Brackett, Private James Lyons, Sergeant Michael Mira, Private Willoughby Sawyer, and others now formed a list that every surviving soldier in the command could recite by memory before the end of the day. On the plateau, surgeons and hospital stewards set up a crude aid station behind a slight rise. Men were laid out on blankets or bare ground. Clothing was cut away from wounds to allow examination of shattered limbs, torn flesh, and deep bullet tracks. Water from canteens and buckets carried up from below washed powders and grit from injuries as best it could. The smell in that narrow area mixed blood, sweat, carbolic, and the ever-present dust. Surgeons worked with the speed and focus that come only from long practice under harsh conditions, deciding when to probe, when to bind, and when to leave a wound alone, because nothing in their limited kit would improve it. As the light faded, Crook gathered reports from his officers. Each company commander provided numbers of dead, wounded, and missing. The tally was sobering. 8 soldiers had been killed in the 2 days of fighting. At least 11 more were wounded badly enough to be counted as casualties, and a larger number carried lesser injuries that did not yet remove them from the line. For a command that had started with roughly 110 soldiers plus scouts and packers, the percentage of men killed or wounded made clear how severe the battle had been. The defenders inside the caverns had paid heavily as well, but exact figures could only be guessed from the bodies seen near the wall and in the outer positions. Crook understood that a second direct assault into the ravine would probably cost even more lives than the first. The enemy still held the main stoneworks. The advantage of height and cover remained with them. Ammunition for the command, while not yet failing, could not be poured indefinitely into the walls without a clear prospect of decisive gain. Facing that arithmetic, he chose a different method. Rather than send more men into the confined hollow, he ordered his soldiers to trap the defenders inside their own fortress as fully as the terrain allowed. The visible cave mouths along the inner face and flanks of the position would be choked with stone. The aim was simple. If the bands inside could not be rooted out without unacceptable loss, then they would be sealed in, cut off from water and food until they could no longer continue the war. Infantry details and dismounted cavalrymen went to work by lantern and firelight along the plateau and the approaches to the main entrances. Men pried loose large rocks with rifle butts, bayonets, and borrowed tools, then dragged or rolled them toward the openings. Every movement raised dust that hung in the still air. At the larger mouths, squads built low walls by stacking boulders until each gap looked more like a rough-filled quarry than a doorway. Smaller vents received single heavy stones carefully settled into place. The work demanded strength that many no longer felt they had. Yet the idea that each block of stone might keep future travelers, ranchers, and miners safe from these same fighters drove the men on. From inside the caverns, the sound of this effort came as a constant rumble through the rock. Families and fighters heard the scrape and thud of rock against rock at the mouths of the main openings. Voices outside shouted commands. Occasionally, a defender fired a shot toward the rim in frustration, but most understood that shooting at the sounds would change nothing. Chio and Sieta measured the new threat with clear eyes. If the visible entrances were sealed and no way out remained, their people would be trapped in chambers that would grow stale and deadly as water ran low and fires consumed the remaining air. In later years, officers who served under Crook recalled one remark he made as he listened to defiant shouts and gunshots echoing from deeper in the caverns while his men rolled rocks into place. He said that he had never wanted high explosive as badly as he did at that moment, when the forts lay just beyond reach behind thick walls of stone. The comment showed the gap between the power he wished he had on that plateau and the tools actually available to him in 1867. Simple rifles, carbines, bayonets, and bare hands working in the dark to change the shape of the fight. Inside the fortress, leaders weighed an answer that the soldiers on the rim could not imagine. The people who had built and occupied this lava stronghold over many seasons knew of passages that did not show from outside. Among the caverns and tubes lay at least one outlet concealed behind breaks in the rock away from the main mouths, reachable only by crawling through tight passages that twisted and dropped before opening out again. That secret way did not offer a path for horses or for heavy loads, but it could carry people who were willing to move slowly, endure darkness, and accept the risk of collapse or discovery. With the main entrances closing under new walls, the hidden route became the only real chance for families and fighters to escape complete confinement. After darkness fell fully on the 27th, preparations began for a quiet withdrawal. Women gathered what they could carry, mostly small bundles of food, water skins, and the few belongings that mattered more than weight. Wounded men who could walk with help were pulled to their feet and given support on either side. Those who could not stand were laid out in positions where relatives could stay with them, or where men agreed to remain and face whatever came, even if that meant eventual capture or death inside the rock. The decision to leave anyone behind cut deeply through families, but the choice stood. If everyone attempted to pass through the tightest sections of the hidden outlet, the entire column might jam in place and die together underground. Shortly before midnight, the first small groups began to move into the narrow corridors leading toward the concealed exit. Torches were kept to a minimum. Most of the way had to be traveled in near darkness, hands on stone and shoulders pressed against uneven walls. Children were carried or guided by touch. Older people moved at their own pace, helped when possible, but never allowed to slow the flow to a stop. At points, the passage narrowed so much that only one person at a time could squeeze through. At those pinch points, men stationed ahead and behind whispered instructions to keep bodies from becoming wedged. In the rear, Chio and other committed fighters waited until the last practical moment to follow, pausing often to listen for any change in sound that might indicate a breach by soldiers from above. On the plateau, pickets heard little of this movement. The rock formation muffled most sounds from the interior, and the soldiers' own low voices and scattered shots filled the night enough to blend with whatever faint echoes a hidden column might have produced. Now and then, a small party of defenders still inside the fortifications emerged through side cracks not yet blocked and fired down toward the valley camp, hoping to stampede the stock or cause confusion. Quartermaster Lieutenant Eskridge kept his guards tight around the horses and pack mules, making sure no one relaxed enough to allow an attack to reach the animals. Those skirmishes reinforced Crook's belief that the enemy remained firmly bottled in front of him. By the last hours before dawn on 28 September, the hidden column of families and fighters had slipped away from the heart of the fortress. Emerging through a low opening on the far side of the formation, they found themselves on rough ground that fell away toward more broken canyons and the wider Modoc Plateau. The night air felt cold and open after the close heat of the caverns. There was no time to rest. Leaders pushed the survivors into motion toward known water sources and distant refuges, spreading them in small groups so that a single discovery would not doom everyone at once. Behind them they left dead in the forts and in the ravine, along with wounded who had chosen or been forced to stay where escape was impossible. On the rim above, Crook's men watched the sky lighten again over the black shapes of the lava. The second dawn over Infernal Caverns seemed calmer on the surface than the first. Only occasional shots came from the stoneworks. Smoke rose faintly from fewer points. Some soldiers believed the defenders had finally resigned themselves to their fate and would wait in silence while hunger and thirst weakened them. Others suspected that the enemy might attempt a desperate breakout against some segment of the perimeter. Crook kept his line in place, rifles trained on the fort entrances and walls as the light strengthened. When full daylight showed that no movement could be seen along the parapets, Crook ordered cautious probes. Small parties of infantry and cavalry backed by scouts moved along the plateau and approached the main entrances that had not yet been entirely filled with stone. They advanced in short rushes, pausing to watch for any sign of fire. No shots greeted them. At the nearest opening, soldiers listened first, expecting at least the sounds of speech, footsteps, or movement within. They heard only the hollow stillness of a large enclosed space. A few volunteers entered the first cave with weapons ready, steps slow and deliberate. Their boots scuffed through ash, splintered wood, and dropped items left behind in the night. The air inside carried the smell of smoke, sweat, and blood, yet no voices answered their arrival. In deeper chambers they found evidence of recent hurried departure, embers in small hearths that still held warmth, blankets and baskets scattered in ways that suggested little time for careful packing, and occasional blood trails that led to empty spots where bodies had been lifted and carried away. Further exploration of the interlinked caverns and tubes revealed the hidden outlet. Soldiers who followed the twisting passage emerged on the far side of the formation where fresh tracks showed many feet moving away before dawn. The path of escape ran over rough, irregular stone, but the marks were still clear enough to show that the defenders had not simply vanished underground. They had slipped through a gap the command had never blocked, one that only those who knew the interior intimately could trust in an emergency. Although many of the bands had escaped, the battle had not been bloodless for them. In the forts, soldiers counted bodies left behind. Some lay in firing chambers shot through loopholes by men on the rim or in the ravine. Others rested in corners where comrades had pulled them out of the way to clear room at the parapet. Rough tallies added to reports of dead seen in the outer pits and on the slopes during the earlier fighting. Convinced Crook and his officers that roughly 20 native men, and possibly some women, had been killed in the 3 days of combat. Among the living found on the field were 2 badly wounded fighters who could not move. They were taken into custody, treated by the same surgeons who worked on the soldiers and would later provide details about the groups and routes involved in earlier raids. With the stronghold now empty of active resistance, Crook turned to the task of honoring his own dead. 6 of the 8 soldiers killed in the fighting could not be taken far over the same rough country that had already consumed so much effort. They were buried at the foot of the slope below the plateau, close to where their last actions had been carried out. Men dug graves as deep as the stony ground allowed and lined them as best they could. Each body, wrapped in blankets or uniforms, was lowered with care and covered while comrades stood nearby, hats in hand. Simple markers of wood and stone noted each man's name, company, and regiment. Later, those markers would be replaced by white marble stones set by the government. But on that day, the rough boards and piled rock were all that stood over the fresh earth. Sergeant David Russler, whose stretcher had reached the valley camp, was placed on a double mule travois for the journey back toward Camp Warner near Goose Lake. His condition remained uncertain, but Crook ordered that every reasonable effort be made to bring him under better shelter and care. The only officer killed in the fight, Lieutenant John Madigan, had already been sent toward the settlements, and he would be buried outside Alturas, where his grave could be visited by families and fellow officers. Private Willoughby Sawyer, Sergeant Miera, First Sergeant Brackett, Private Lyons, and the other enlisted dead remained in the small row on the hillside that would later become the focus of the Infernal Caverns cemetery. When the burials ended, the men who had carried their comrades' bodies and swung the shovels returned to their duties with faces set in hard lines. Some walked once more along the rim of the ravine, looking down into the empty forts and at the scattered remains of gear and ammunition. Others sat on rocks near the newly covered graves, silent, thinking of conversations cut short, and of how quickly a campaign that had begun as another march into hostile country had turned into one of the most costly fights the command had seen. Crook himself noted in reports and later recollections that over 1/3 of his officers and men had been killed or wounded at Infernal Caverns, a proportion that spoke plainly about the strength of the position they had taken and the determination of those who had defended it. For the people who had escaped through the hidden outlet, the end of the battle did not feel like a clear defeat or a clean victory. They had lost kin and leaders, including Sieta, who fell under Crook's fire during the height of the fighting. They had abandoned a fortress that had served them through earlier years and could no longer rely on it as a refuge. At the same time, they had preserved many lives that would have been lost if the ceiling of the main entrances had trapped everyone inside. Their route across the plateau now led toward other camps, new calculations, and the next stages of a war that was narrowing their options with every season. On 28 September 1867, the noise of battle finally died in the Infernal Caverns. In its place remained the quiet work of burying, counting, and writing reports. The trap the defenders had built into the land had held long enough to strike hard at the command that pursued them and to remind officers, settlers, and native families across the region that in this country ground itself could be turned into a weapon. The soldiers left behind fresh graves and the impression of a dangerous victory. The survivors who slipped away carried memories of stone, smoke, and close combat that would shape how they viewed every future march of armed men across the high volcanic tableland. In the closing days of September 1867, the column that had fought at Infernal Caverns pulled away from the lava stronghold in a slow, deliberate withdrawal. Wagons creaked under the weight of wounded men and salvaged supplies. Pack mules carried ammunition chests lighter than when they had arrived, their sides streaked with dried sweat and dust. Horses picked their way down from the plateau past the newly filled graves at the foot of the slope, ears flicking toward the silent caverns that had taken so many lives. George Crook rode with his officers near the head of the column, the ravine and its stone forts now behind them, the long road back toward Camp Warner and Goose Lake ahead. The line moved north across the same broken ground it had crossed on the way in, but the mood had changed. On the approach marches, soldiers had talked about catching and punishing the bands responsible for raids and the killing of the miners. Now conversations fell into shorter exchanges. Men spoke about comrades left in the hillside cemetery, about how close they themselves had come to falling in the ravine, and about what the fight said regarding the kind of war they were engaged in. The casualty lists, 8 dead and at least 11 badly wounded out of roughly 110 soldiers, made clear that even a column led by an experienced commander could suffer serious damage when it entered ground chosen by the enemy. At Camp Warner, the returning troops were met by garrison men who had heard rumors without details. A few had expected news of an easy success, another report that a strong force had broken scattered resistance. Instead, they saw bandaged arms, slings, men limping, and the faces of officers who had lost trusted non-commissioned leaders. The story that spread through barracks and messes described a place where stone and narrow spaces had turned advantage upside down. A fight in which soldiers who thought they held the heights discovered that the real advantage lay with those who had prepared the positions inside the rock. Crook filed official reports that summarized the facts in the plain tone expected of military correspondence. They recorded numbers of killed and wounded on each side, the sequence of the engagement on the plateau and in the ravine, and the actions taken afterward. Between the lines lay assessments that did not have to be spelled out. The position at Infernal Caverns had been extremely strong. The hostile bands had shown courage and skill in its defense. The cost of taking the place by direct assault had been high enough that, in similar terrain, alternative methods would have to be considered in the future. In the months that followed, operations across the wider Snake War theater continued. Patrols still rode out from Fort Boise, Camp Warner, and other posts, but the concentration of resistance that had centered in part on the routes near Goose Lake and the Pit River began to thin. The loss of fighters in the caverns, the shock of facing a commander willing to push columns through winter and into strongholds, and the constant pressure on camps and food supplies pushed more bands toward negotiation or dispersal. Small groups came in under flags of truce at different posts, handing over some weapons and accepting terms that bound them to reservations or to restricted travel. For Northern Paiute, Pit River, and related peoples, the choices offered were harsh. Some groups were sent to reservations far from their home ranges, where they had to adjust to unfamiliar climates, foods, and rules. Others were pressured onto reservations closer to their traditional lands, but under regimes that controlled hunting, movement, and contact with outside communities. The same landscapes that had sustained them for generations, including the Modoc Plateau, the Warner Mountains, and the basins around Goose Lake and the Pit River, now lay under increasing control by ranchers, settlers, and state authorities backed by permanent military posts. The area around Infernal Caverns itself saw more permanent changes. Trails that had been known mainly to native families and a few trappers became more familiar to surveyors, stockmen, and road builders. As ranches spread in the Surprise Valley and Likely area, the lava stronghold stood within riding distance of men who had lost relatives in earlier raids or who had fought under Crook. They rode to the site and showed others where the ravine cut into the basalt, where the forts had stood, and where the graves of the soldiers lay at the slope's base. The place acquired a fixed position in local talk, a landmark tied not to geology but to memory of a particular fight. Crook did not remain in the region indefinitely. After the end of the Snake War, he moved on to other commands, carrying with him the lessons of campaigns against mobile bands in hard country. When he took up new duties in Arizona and later in other territories, the experience of fighting at places like Infernal Caverns shaped how he approached strongholds in canyons, mountains, and arid basins. He relied heavily on native scouts, insisted on mobility and persistence, and remained wary of charging directly into ground that an enemy had prepared. In California and Oregon, civil authorities and settlers interpreted the decline in raids near major roads and settlements as proof that the frontier war in their area was approaching an end. Stagecoaches resumed running with fewer guards along some stretches. Freight outfits loosened some of the tight formations they had adopted at the height of the conflict. Small towns that had once felt on the edge of constant danger began to concentrate more on stock prices, crop yields, and local politics than on watch schedules and fortifying barns. Yet for native families who had survived the fighting and the forced movements that followed, the years after Infernal Caverns did not feel like peace in any comfortable sense. Reservations were often underfunded and poorly supplied. Promises made during negotiations were not always kept. Traditional hunting and gathering patterns were broken by fences, railroad lines, and the sheer presence of more people using the land in different ways. Older men and women who remembered the years before the mass arrival of emigrants told children about times when trails followed water and game rather than survey lines and wagon ruts. The story of Infernal Caverns for them was not just the account of a difficult battle. It was part of a larger story about losing the ability to choose where and how to live. As the 19th century drew toward its end, official memory of the battle took on a particular shape. In county histories and commemorative speeches written from the settlers' perspective, Infernal Caverns appeared as one of the last major Indian fights in California, an event framed as a final contest that secured the region for ranching, farming, and mining. Writers emphasized the determination of Crook's command, the bravery of the soldiers who went down into the ravine, and the idea that the victory, though costly, had removed a persistent threat to travel and settlement. Physical markers reinforced that version of events. The small cemetery at the foot of the slope where 6 enlisted men lay became a formal burial ground, eventually receiving standard government headstones. Each stone bore the name, rank, and unit of the man below, tying individual deaths to a larger national narrative. Local groups, including veterans organizations and patriotic societies, placed plaques or markers near the site, identifying it as the scene of an Indian battle and describing the soldiers as having fallen in the line of duty while protecting settlers and travelers. Over time, visitors came to the site with different purposes. Some were descendants of people who had fought there, seeking to stand where their ancestor had held a line or died. Others were residents of nearby communities who had grown up hearing about a lava fortress and a ravine full of smoke and gunfire and wanted to see the ground themselves. They walked along the plateau, peered over the edges into the now quiet hollow, and looked at the arrangement of stone and earth beneath which the graves lay. For most of them, the information available came from markers and local retellings, which emphasized the soldiers' ordeal more than the experiences of the people who had defended the caverns. Among native communities, the memory of the battle persisted in other forms. Families that traced their descent to people who had fought or sheltered in the caverns carried the story and oral accounts that focused on the clever use of terrain, the courage shown in the face of a much better supplied enemy, and the grief that followed the loss of kin and of a stronghold that could no longer be safely used. For them, the lesson of Infernal Caverns lay in both the power and the limits of turning land into a trap. The caverns had allowed them to inflict heavy casualties and to escape the full intent of Crook's attempted sealing, but they had not prevented the broader pressure that continued to narrow their lands and choices. The wider region, stretching from the Pitt River Basin through the Warner Mountains and across to Goose Lake, changed in ways that would have been hard to imagine during the years when the Snake War burned hottest. Cattle and sheep grazed in meadows where raiding parties had once gathered. Fences marked property lines across ground that had always been shared by seasonal use. Towns like Alturas and Likely grew from scattered ranches into more established communities with schools, churches, and businesses that depended more on regional trade than on distant mining booms. Railroads and improved wagon roads shortened travel times and made it easier for state and federal authorities to project power into valleys and plateaus that had once seemed remote. In that new order, the tactical lessons of Infernal Caverns still mattered. Officers who studied reports from the Snake War and later conflicts understood that pursuing an enemy into natural fortresses without careful reconnaissance risked losses out of proportion to any gain. Frontier training began to stress the use of scouts, the importance of flanking maneuvers, and the danger of assuming that driving an opponent into a confined space always meant the battle was as good as won. The idea that a pursuing force could feel on the verge of victory while actually walking into a carefully prepared killing ground became part of professional military caution. For the civilians whose lives had been shaped by the earlier conflict, the memory of the caverns sometimes surfaced in quieter ways. Stories told at gatherings in Surprise Valley or around kitchen tables in ranch houses near Goose Lake would mention a grandfather who had ridden under Crook, a relative who had served as a packer like John O'Neill, or an ancestor who had fled across the plateau through hidden exits. In such stories, the line between pride and regret could be thin. People might express satisfaction that their families had survived and secured land, while also acknowledging in more private tones the suffering inflicted on those who had been pushed from the same country. By the early years of the 20th century, Infernal Caverns occupied a fixed place in local and state histories as an example of the last hard clashes between United States forces and native bands in California. The cemetery at the base of the slope, the markers near Likely, and the continued presence of tribal communities who remembered the fight ensured that the event would not disappear into anonymity. Anyone who stood on the plateau could still see how a column of soldiers might feel confident as it pushed hostile fighters back toward what looked like a pocket, and how, once the ravine and walls were fully in view, that sense of control could vanish in the face of ground used with intimate knowledge. In that way, the legacy of Infernal Caverns reached beyond the details of troop movements and casualty counts. It showed how the overlapping pressures of warfare, settlement, and survival in the Old West played out in specific places where land, decision, and human will met. Men like George Crook, Chio, and Sieta made choices there that reflected years of prior conflict. The soldiers who believed they had cornered their opponents discovered in the ravine that the very act of pursuit had placed them at a disadvantage. The families who used hidden passages to escape carried forward a memory of both resistance and loss. Long after the last shot echoed off the basalt walls, the story of how one side thought it had won, only to be caught in an Indian trap laid in stone, remained embedded in the landscape and in the lives of the people who continued to live around it.